They left her to die. That's what Hazel Thornton understood as she watched the last wagon disappear into the western dust. Her aunt's cold eyes, the final thing she saw before the prairie swallowed them whole. 20 years old, alone on the Colorado frontier in 1867, with nothing but a broken trunk and the certainty that the wilderness would claim her by nightfall. Then a rider emerged from the heat shimmer, a cowboy with eyes like winter sky who would change everything. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The silence was the worst part. Hazel had grown accustomed to noise over the past 3 months. The constant creak of wagon wheels, the lowing of oxen, children crying, women singing hymns to pass the endless miles, men shouting orders that carried across the plains like gunshots. The wagon train had been a moving city of sound, a cacophony of survival that never ceased, not even in sleep. But now there was nothing, just wind, just the whisper of tall grass bending in waves across the Colorado prairie and the hammering of her own heart against her ribs. She stood exactly where they'd left her, as if moving might somehow make it more real. Her legs trembled beneath her calico dress, the same dress she'd mended 3 times since leaving Independence, Missouri. The same dress she'd been wearing when her aunt had looked her dead in the eye that morning and said, "You've been nothing but a burden since your parents died. We're done carrying you." Hazel's trunk lay overturned in the dirt beside her, its leather straps broken, her few possessions scattered like seeds the wind might carry away. A spare dress, a Bible her mother had given her, a tin daguerreotype of her parents, young and smiling in a world that no longer existed, 3 letters she'd never sent, a silver hairbrush with half its bristles missing. Everything she owned in this world, and it all fit in a space no bigger than a coffin. The wagon train was already a mile distant, maybe more. She could still see it, a dark line of movement against the endless horizon, trailing dust like a comet's tail. 73 wagons, 218 souls, including the children. She knew because she'd counted them during the long days of walking, something to occupy her mind while her feet bled through her worn boots. Not one of them had looked back. Well, that wasn't entirely true. Samuel Pritchard, the wagon master's teenage son, had turned his horse around once, his young face twisted with something that might have been shame or pity. But his father had barked at him. Hazel heard the sharp command even from a distance. And Samuel had ridden on, his shoulders hunched forward like a man twice his age carrying a weight he couldn't name. The sun hung overhead like a brass coin in a sky too big and too blue to be real. It had to be near 2 o'clock, which meant she had maybe 4 hours of daylight left. 4 hours to figure out how to survive in a landscape that stretched in every direction without mercy, without shelter, without hope. "Think, Hazel," she whispered to herself, her voice strange in the vast emptiness. Think. But thinking required belief in a future, and future was something that had just rolled away on wooden wheels, abandoning her to whatever fate the frontier had in mind. Her Aunt Martha and Uncle Silas had made it clear from the beginning that taking her in after the cholera epidemic had been an act of Christian charity, not love. Hazel had been 16 when the disease swept through their small Illinois town like the angel of death, claiming her parents within days of each other. She'd survived. Sometimes she wondered if that had been the greater curse. "You'll earn your keep," Aunt Martha had said, her thin lips pressed into a line that never smiled. "And you'll be grateful for it." Hazel had been grateful. She'd scrubbed floors until her knees were raw. She'd cooked and cleaned and mended and never complained. Not once. Even when her aunt's criticisms came sharp as thorns. Even when her uncle looked at her in ways that made her skin crawl. Even when she understood she would always be the poor relation, the burden, the girl who should have died with her parents. When they'd announced they were joining a wagon train to Colorado, rumors of silver, of opportunity, of starting fresh. Hazel had felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Hope. Maybe the West would be different. Maybe she could become someone new, someone valued, someone free. She'd been a fool. The breaking point had come 3 days ago. They'd stopped at a way station, and Hazel had gone to fetch water from the creek. On her way back, she'd encountered Thomas Barrow, a married man from another wagon whose eyes had followed her since independence. He'd cornered her behind the supply wagons, his hands reaching, his breath hot with whiskey. She'd screamed, she'd fought, she'd broken free, and run straight to her aunt and uncle, her dress torn, her face streaked with tears. And Aunt Martha had slapped her. "Temptress," her aunt had hissed. "You brought this on yourself, parading around like a Jezebel. You've shamed us." Hazel had tried to protest, but Uncle Silas had simply turned away, and that night she'd heard them whispering in their wagon, words like trouble and liability and better off without her. She should have known then, should have run. But where? Into the wilderness alone? She'd convinced herself they wouldn't actually abandon her, that blood meant something, that Christian mercy would prevail. Another foolish hope. This morning, Aunt Martha had woken her before dawn. "Get your things together, just what you can carry in your trunk. We're lightening the load." Hazel had obeyed, her hands shaking as she packed. She'd thought maybe they were giving her to another family, or sending her back east with a returning trader. She'd thought many things, but she hadn't thought. The memory of what had actually happened made her knees buckle. She sat down hard in the dirt, right there beside her scattered belongings, and for the first time since her parents died, she let herself cry. Not delicate tears, but great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken inside her. They'd stopped the wagon, told her to get down. Uncle Silas had thrown her trunk after her, not even bothering to set it down gently, and Aunt Martha had delivered her final judgment. "You're a grown woman now, Hazel, 20 years old enough to make your own way. We've fed you and clothed you and suffered your presence for 4 years. Our debt to your parents is paid." "Please," Hazel had begged, hating herself for it, even as the word left her lips. "Please don't leave me here. I'll do better. I'll be better. You'll die out here," Aunt Martha had said flatly. "But that's not our concern anymore. Perhaps you'll find some cowboy or Indian to take pity on you. God knows we've done all we can." And then they'd simply ridden away, as if she were a piece of furniture they'd decided not to haul any farther. The tears eventually stopped, leaving Hazel hollow and salt-stained, and aware that crying accomplished nothing. The sun hadn't paused in its arc across the sky. The wind hadn't stopped to comfort her. The prairie grass kept bending and rising like a green-gold ocean, indifferent to her suffering. She forced herself to stand, to assess her situation with whatever practical sense she could muster. Her throat was already dry. She'd need water soon. The nearest creek was... where? They'd crossed one that morning, but that had to be 5 miles back at least, and she wasn't certain she could find it, even if she tried. There might be another ahead, but walking in the direction the wagon train had gone felt like chasing ghosts. She had no food, no weapon. The dress she wore, a spare in her trunk, her mother's Bible, the daguerreotype, the letters, the hairbrush. Not even a knife. Aunt Martha had been thorough. "So this is how it ends," Hazel said aloud, needing to hear a human voice even if it was only her own. Hazel Thornton, born 1847, died 1867, forgotten before the wolves even finished picking her bones clean. The thought of wolves made her look around sharply, suddenly aware of how exposed she was. The prairie seemed empty, but she knew that was an illusion. There were things out here. Predators, storms, hostile Indians, outlaws. The wagon master had told enough stories around the campfires to make everyone understand that the frontier didn't care about your dreams or your prayers or your desperate need to survive. It just took what it wanted. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals she couldn't see. Was it already marking her as carrion? Did animals know when something was about to die? Hazel shook her head sharply, trying to clear the morbid thoughts. No, she wouldn't give up, not yet. She'd gather her things properly, see what she actually had to work with. Maybe she could flag down another wagon train if one came through. Maybe... The sound of hoofbeats froze her in place. At first she thought she'd imagined it, but no. There it was again. A horse, moving at an easy lope, coming from the east. From behind her, from the direction they'd already traveled. Hazel's heart began to race for entirely different reasons. A lone rider on the Colorado prairie could mean many things. Salvation, danger, death wearing a different face. She turned slowly, shading her eyes against the sun, and watched as the rider materialized out of the heat shimmer like something conjured from her desperate prayers. He was still a quarter-mile off, but even from that distance, Hazel could tell he was no farmer or merchant. He sat his horse like a man born to the saddle, and there was something about the way he moved, a kind of easy confidence or maybe wariness, that spoke of experience. His hat was pulled low against the sun, and he wore a long duster that flapped behind him like dark wings. Hazel's first instinct was to run, but where? And toward what? She was already trapped in the most dangerous place she could be, completely alone and completely vulnerable. So she stood her ground, smoothing her dress with trembling hands and trying to look less terrified than she felt. Her mother had always said that deportment mattered, that how you carried yourself told the world who you were. Hazel had very little left, but she still had her spine. The rider slowed as he approached, and Hazel got her first clear look at him. He was younger than she'd initially thought, maybe late 20s or early 30, with several days' worth of dark stubble on his jaw and eyes the color of winter sky, pale blue and sharp. His face was sun-weathered and hard in the way of men who'd seen things they couldn't forget, but there was no obvious cruelty in it. That, at least, was something. He brought his horse to a stop about 20 feet away, his gaze moving from Hazel to her scattered possessions to the wagon tracks leading west, and she watched his expression shift from curiosity to understanding to something that might have been anger. "They left you," he said. It wasn't a question. Hazel lifted her chin. "I'm waiting for friends who will be along shortly." The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting, but pride demanded she try. Pride was all she had left. The rider's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Ma'am, I've been trailing that wagon train for 2 days, and I haven't seen another soul out here except you and them. And from where I'm sitting, it looks like they threw you off like bad cargo." Heat flooded Hazel's face, shame and anger mixing into something poisonous. "That's none of your concern, sir. I'm managing just fine." "Are you?" He said it flatly, and his eyes went to the sky where the hawk still circled, then to the horizon in every direction. Empty, all of it empty. When his gaze returned to her, it was matter of fact. "You've got maybe 4 hours of daylight, no horse, no food that I can see, no gun. That wagon train's moving at a good clip. You'll never catch them on foot, even if you wanted to. The nearest settlement is Pueblo, and that's 40 miles southwest from here." He paused. "You know how to make fire without a flint? Know which plants will kill you and which ones won't? Know how to find water when there's no creek in sight?" Each question landed like a blow, stripping away the pretense of her lie. Hazel wanted to scream at him, to tell him to go away and let her die in peace, if that's what was going to happen, but her voice had fled somewhere deep inside where her pride was hiding. The rider shifted in his saddle, leather creaking, and when he spoke again his tone had gentled just slightly. "I'm not trying to scare you, ma'am. I'm trying to make sure you understand your situation clear. This land," he gestured broadly, "it doesn't care about fair or unfair. It just is. And being out here alone after dark, that's not something anyone survives without luck and skill, and I'm guessing you're short on both right now." "Then what do you suggest?" Hazel heard herself ask, her voice small and defeated. The rider studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable sense that he was weighing her worth, deciding if she was worth the trouble of saving. Finally, he seemed to come to some internal decision. He swung down from his horse with an easy grace that made it look effortless, though Hazel noticed he kept himself between her and the animal. Whether to protect her or himself, she wasn't certain. Up close, he was taller than she'd realized, 6 feet at least, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean strength that came from hard living. There was a gun on his hip, well worn and practical, and Hazel found herself staring at it until he cleared his throat. "Name's Cole Maddox," he said, touching the brim of his hat in something approximating courtesy. "Used to ride with the Union cavalry during the war. These days I work cattle drives, ranch hand jobs, whatever pays. I'm heading toward Pueblo myself." "Hazel Thornton." She forced the words out. "And before you ask, yes, my family abandoned me. My aunt and uncle decided I was too much trouble to keep. There. You have the sordid truth." Something flickered across Cole's face. Not pity, exactly, but recognition. Like he understood something about being discarded. "How long since you ate?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. This morning, they gave me breakfast before they—" She couldn't finish. Cole nodded and walked back to his horse, reaching into his saddlebag. He produced a bundle wrapped in cloth and brought it to her, dried beef, hard biscuits, and a small chunk of cheese. Hazel's stomach growled audibly at the sight. "Eat," he said. "Then we'll talk about what happens next." "I can't pay you," Hazel said quickly. "I have nothing of value unless you want a silver hairbrush with half the bristles gone." That did earn her a small smile. "Keep your hairbrush, Miss Thornton. I'm not in this for payment." "Then why help me at all?" Cole was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice had gone somewhere distant. "Because I know what it's like to be left behind, and I reckon nobody deserves to die alone on the prairie just because their kin turned out to be cowards." The simple kindness of it broke something in Hazel's chest. She took the food with shaking hands and ate without speaking, while Cole walked back to his horse and began checking his gear with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. The dried beef was tough and salty, the biscuits hard enough to crack teeth, but it was food, and Hazel devoured it with a desperation that would have mortified her in any other circumstance. Cole pretended not to notice, giving her the dignity of privacy in her hunger. When she'd finished, he handed her a canteen. "Drink slow," he instructed. "Too fast and you'll make yourself sick." Hazel obeyed, forcing herself to take small sips even though she wanted to drain the entire container. The water was warm and tasted faintly of metal, but it was the most wonderful thing she'd ever consumed. "Thank you," she said when she handed it back. "Truly, you probably saved my life just now." "Well, we're not out of the woods yet, metaphorically speaking, since there aren't any woods for 100 miles. Cole's eyes scanned the horizon again, and Hazel noticed how his hand never strayed far from his gun. "Miss Thornton, I'm going to be direct with you because time's wasting and sugarcoating things won't help either of us. You need to get to civilization, and I'm heading that direction anyway. I can take you to Pueblo. There's folks there who can help you figure out your next steps." Hazel hesitated. She knew what traveling alone with a man meant, how it would look, what people would say. A woman's reputation was often all she had, and once lost, it couldn't be reclaimed. But then again, what good was reputation to a corpse? "I understand your hesitation," Cole said, and his voice held no judgment. "If you're worried about propriety, I can't blame you. But I'll give you my word as a former cavalryman, I'll treat you with respect. No harm will come to you from me. We'll travel by day, sleep separately at night, and once we reach Pueblo, you'll never have to see me again if that's your choice." Hazel searched his face for signs of deception and found none. His pale blue eyes met hers steadily, and she realized with a start that this was a man who meant exactly what he said. No more, no less. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Cole looked away toward the western horizon where the wagon train had disappeared. "Because during the war I saw a lot of people get left behind. Wounded men, civilians, families trying to escape the fighting, and I learned that sometimes the measure of a person isn't what they do when everyone's watching, it's what they do when nobody's looking, when the easy thing would be to ride on and pretend you never saw the problem." He turned back to her. "I saw you, Miss Thornton, and I can't unsee you, so the way I figure it, I've got two choices. Help you, or spend the rest of my life wondering what happened to the girl they left to die on the Colorado prairie. And I've already got enough ghosts, don't need another one." The honesty of it, the raw humanity, made Hazel's decision for her. She nodded once, quickly, before fear could change her mind. "All right," she said. "I accept your help. And please, call me Hazel. I think we're past formal titles now." "Hazel it is." Cole moved to gather her scattered belongings, handling each item with care. "And you can call me Cole. Now, we've got a problem. My horse is strong, but carrying 2 people plus gear 40 miles. That's going to be slow going and hard on him. We'll have to walk part of the way, switch off riding. It'll take us 3, maybe 4 days if we don't run into trouble." "And if we do run into trouble?" Cole's expression went grim. "Then it takes however long it takes, and we deal with whatever comes. I'm not going to lie to you, Hazel. This won't be easy or comfortable, but it beats the alternative. Death." He didn't say the word, but they both heard it hanging in the air between them. Hazel helped him gather her things, and Cole fashioned a makeshift pack from her spare dress, tying it securely behind his saddle. The daguerreotype of her parents, the Bible, the letters. He handled them all with surprising gentleness, as if he understood these weren't just objects, but fragments of a life. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I've been on a horse a few times," Hazel admitted, Though it's been years, and I wasn't very good even then. You'll ride with me for now, till we get clear of this area. Then we'll see about you taking the horse solo for a while. Give you practice." He swung up into the saddle with that same easy grace, then extended a hand down to her. "Put your foot in the stirrup, and I'll pull you up." Hazel had never been this close to a man who wasn't family, never felt the strength in a stranger's grip as Cole hauled her up behind him as if she weighed nothing at all. She settled awkwardly onto the horse's back, suddenly aware of how improper this was. Her dress riding up, her legs on either side of the animal, her body pressed against Cole's back because there was nowhere else to go. "You're going to want to hold on," Cole said over his shoulder. "Horse moves different when he's carrying two. Don't be shy about it. I won't think less of you for not wanting to fall off." Hazel wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt, the play of muscles as he adjusted his seat. Her cheek ended up against his shoulder blade, and she could smell horse and leather and sweat and something else, gun oil, maybe, or the dust of 1,000 miles. "Ready?" Cole asked. "No," Hazel said honestly. "But I suppose that doesn't matter." She felt him laugh, a small rumble in his chest. "Fair enough. Here we go." He urged the horse forward, not toward the wagon train, but southwest, toward Pueblo and whatever waited there. The horse moved into an easy walk, and Hazel gripped tighter, closing her eyes against the strange vertigo of movement and fear and reluctant hope. Behind them, the place where she'd been abandoned grew smaller and smaller until it was nothing but another anonymous stretch of prairie, indistinguishable from all the rest. Ahead, the sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, and Hazel tried not to think about what would happen when darkness came. "Cole?" she said after they'd been riding for perhaps 20 minutes. "Yeah?" "Those wolves you mentioned, are they really out here?" There was a pause, and she felt him shift slightly in the saddle. "Yes," he said, "but they're generally more scared of us than we are of them. Generally." "That's not very reassuring." "Wasn't meant to be. I don't believe in pretty lies. But I will tell you this. I've got a gun, I know how to use it, and I've faced worse things than wolves." His voice gentled just slightly. "You're going to be all right, Hazel. I won't let anything happen to you." It was a promise he had no business making, a guarantee no one could give in a land as wild and unpredictable as this. But Hazel found herself believing him anyway, because the alternative was despair, and she'd tasted enough of that already today. They rode on as the sun arced westward, two unlikely companions on a Colorado prairie that stretched forever in every direction. Cole kept up a steady pace, not rushing but not dawdling either, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for threats Hazel couldn't even imagine. After an hour, he finally spoke again. "Tell me about your family, the ones who abandoned you." Hazel stiffened. "Why would you want to know about them?" "Because it'll help pass the time, and because I'm trying to understand what kind of people leave a 20-year-old girl to die alone. I've seen a lot of ugly things, but that—" He shook his head. "That takes a special kind of cruelty." So Hazel told him. About her parents, kind and loving until cholera had stolen them. About moving in with Aunt Martha and Uncle Silas. About the years of servitude disguised as charity. About Thomas Barrow at the way station and the slap that had sealed her fate. She told it all in a flat, emotionless voice, as if she were recounting someone else's story, someone else's pain. Cole listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for so long she thought perhaps he'd judged her somehow, found her lacking or deserving of abandonment after all. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I'm sorry that happened to you. None of it was your fault. You know that, right? Not the cholera, not your aunt's cruelty, not that bastard who put his hands on you. None of it." Hazel's throat tightened. "My aunt said I tempted him, that I—" "Your aunt was wrong." Cole's voice had gone hard. "Men who force themselves on women, who corner girls half their age, they make their own choices. And the people who blame the victims for it are cowards trying to dodge responsibility for stopping it." The fierce conviction in his words startled her. "You sound like you've given this some thought." "I had a sister," Cole said quietly. "Sarah. She was 17 when a Confederate raiding party came through our farm during the war. By the time I got home from fighting—" He stopped, and Hazel felt his shoulders tighten beneath her hands. Let's just say I learned firsthand what happens when men decide a woman's worth less than their own desires. And I learned how quick people are to blame the girl instead of the monsters. I'm sorry, Hazel whispered. Did she? She survived, if you can call it that. But something broke inside her that day. She married the first man who asked her, moved to California, and I haven't heard from her in 3 years. Last letter said she was fine, but I know better. Cole adjusted his hat. Point is, I know what it looks like when someone's been failed by the people who should have protected them. And I'll be damned if I fail you too. They rode on as the sun began its final descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and deepening purple. Cole eventually called a halt at a small creek, barely more than a trickle, but water nonetheless. He helped Hazel down from the horse and immediately set about making camp with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of years doing exactly this. We'll stay here tonight, he announced. Water for the horse, and there's enough scrub brush to make a fire. You'll sleep on one side of the flames, I'll sleep on the other. Anyone or anything that wants to get to you has to go through me first. You make it sound like we're preparing for battle, Hazel said, trying for levity. Cole didn't smile. We are. This land is a battlefield, Hazel. Every day you wake up out here is a small victory. Every night you survive is a won war. He showed her how to gather kindling, how to arrange stones for a fire pit, how to check the area for snake holes and scorpion nests. Hazel absorbed it all with a desperation born of necessity. This was survival knowledge, the kind of learning that might mean the difference between living and dying if she ever found herself alone again. The fire, when Cole finally got it going, was a small miracle of warmth and light against the gathering darkness. Hazel sat close to it, watching flames dance and crack, while Cole tended to his horse with the same quiet care he'd shown her belongings. What's his name? Hazel asked, nodding toward the animal. Doesn't have one. I don't name things I might have to eat. Hazel's eyes widened in horror, and Cole laughed, a real laugh this time, open and genuine. I'm joking. His name's Ash on account of his color. Had him for 3 years now. Best horse I've ever owned. You're terrible, Hazel said, but she found herself smiling despite everything. Cole settled on the opposite side of the fire, close enough for conversation but far enough to be proper. He pulled dried meat from his pack and handed some across to her, along with more of the hard biscuits. Not much, but it'll keep us going, he said. Tomorrow we'll see about catching some fish from one of the creeks if we're lucky. Maybe find some wild onions. They ate in companionable silence, and Hazel marveled at how strange this was. Sitting around a campfire with a man she'd met only hours ago, her entire life reduced to what could fit in a saddle pack, her future uncertain as smoke. Can I ask you something? Hazel said after a while. Shoot. Why were you following that wagon train? You said you'd been trailing it for 2 days. Cole poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward into the night. I wasn't following the train exactly. I was traveling the same direction, and wagon trains are useful landmarks. Also, he hesitated. Sometimes outlaws follow trains looking for stragglers or easy targets. I've been keeping an eye out, making sure nobody was stalking them. Out of the goodness of your heart? Out of boredom, mostly. And yeah, maybe a little goodness. Though don't go spreading that around. I've got a reputation as a surly bastard to maintain. Hazel smiled at that. Your secret's safe with me. As full darkness fell, the prairie came alive with sounds Hazel had never noticed when she was surrounded by 73 wagons and 200 people. Crickets chirped in rhythmic waves. Something howled in the distance, wolves or coyotes, Hazel couldn't tell. The wind moved through the grass like invisible hands, creating whispers that sounded almost like voices. It's so big, she said softly. The sky. I've never seen so many stars. Cole looked up, and for a moment his hard expression softened. Yeah, that's one thing the war taught me, how small we are, how little any of our fights and feuds matter compared to all this. He gestured broadly at the cosmos. Makes problems feel different when you realize you're just a speck under an infinity of stars. Is that comforting or terrifying? Both, neither. Depends on the day. They talked into the night about the war, about the West, about the strange alchemy of hope and hardship that drove people to cross a continent in search of something better. Cole told her about cavalry charges and winter camps and losing friends to bullets and dysentery and simple bad luck. Hazel told him about growing up in Illinois, about her mother teaching her to read, about the garden her father had kept where roses grew wild and impossible. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with her. Cole noticed her eyes drooping and stood, producing a blanket from his gear. "Here," he said, tossing it across the fire to her. "It'll get cold before morning. Wrap up good. What about you?" "I've got my duster, and I've slept in worse conditions than this, believe me." Hazel wrapped herself in the blanket. It smelled like horse and campfire smoke, and something indefinably coal, and lay down on the hard ground, using her folded spare dress as a pillow. Above her, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and she tried to remember the last time she'd felt this strange combination of terror and safety. "Cole?" she said quietly. "Still here? Thank you for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." There was a long silence, and then his voice came out of the darkness, rough with something that might have been emotion. "You already did, Hazel. You chose to trust me. In a world this brutal, trust is worth more than gold." Hazel closed her eyes and listened to the crackle of the fire, to Cole's steady breathing, to the vast, wild song of the Colorado night. Tomorrow would bring new fears, new challenges, new miles of uncertainty. But tonight, for the first time since her parents died, she wasn't alone. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. Dawn came soft and pink across the prairie, and Hazel woke to the smell of coffee brewing over embers. She sat up, disoriented for a moment, her body aching from sleeping on hard ground. Then memory flooded back. The abandonment, Cole Maddox appearing like something conjured from desperation, the long ride to this nameless creek. Cole was already up, crouched by the fire with a battered tin pot balanced on stones. He glanced over when she stirred, his face shadowed beneath his hat. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's almost ready. It's not good, but it's hot." Hazel pushed the blanket aside and stood, trying to smooth her wrinkled dress with hands that felt clumsy and cold. Her hair had come loose from its pins during the night, hanging in tangles down her back. She must look like something the prairie had chewed up and spat out. "Is there water for washing?" she asked, hating how self-conscious she sounded. Cole pointed downstream. "Creek's clean enough about 20 yards that way. I'll stay here, give you privacy. But don't go far, and if you hear anything strange, you holler." Hazel nodded and made her way to the creek, her boots crunching on dry grass. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, and she knelt beside it, splashing her face and neck. The shock of it woke her fully, sharpening the reality of where she was and what had happened. Yesterday she'd been part of a wagon train, surrounded by people even if they didn't care for her. Today she was utterly dependent on a stranger's charity, traveling toward an unknown future in a town she'd never seen. The change was so absolute it felt like being born into a different life. She did her best to tidy herself, braiding her hair with fingers that remembered the pattern, even if her mind was elsewhere. When she returned to camp, Cole handed her a tin cup of coffee so strong it could strip paint. "Thank you," she said, taking a cautious sip. He hadn't lied. It was terrible, but it was warm, and warmth felt like luxury. Cole had already packed most of their gear, moving with the kind of economy that spoke of countless mornings exactly like this one. He kicked dirt over the fire, scattering the stones, erasing evidence they'd ever been there. "We should make good time today if the weather holds," he said. "I'm thinking we'll ride for 2 hours, then you'll take Ash for a spell while I walk. Switch off like that throughout the day. Easier on the horse, and you need to learn to ride proper anyway." "I told you I'm not very good," Hazel protested. "Then you'll get better. Out here, skills matter more than propriety." He swung up into the saddle and extended his hand. "Come on, daylight's burning." Hazel let him pull her up behind him again, settling into what was becoming a familiar position, arms around his waist, body pressed against his back. It should have felt scandalous. Instead, it felt like survival. They rode as the sun climbed higher, turning the prairie from pink to gold to harsh white light. Cole kept up a steady commentary, pointing out landmarks Hazel would have missed. A distinctive rock formation that meant water was near, the way certain birds circled when there were small animals below, the difference between tracks left by deer and those left by something more dangerous. "You're trying to teach me," Hazel realized aloud. "Trying to keep you alive," Cole corrected. "There's a difference. Teaching is what you do in schoolrooms. This is just making sure you've got enough knowledge to not die stupid." "Die stupid?" Hazel couldn't help but laugh. "Is that a technical term?" "It is now." She felt his shoulders relax slightly, tension easing. "Most people who die out here do it because they didn't know better. Drank bad water, ate poison berries, walked into a situation they should have seen coming. I figure if I can give you enough information to avoid the obvious mistakes, your chances improve considerably." After 2 hours of riding, Cole brought Ash to a halt and dismounted. "Your turn," he announced. "I'll walk for a spell, you ride." Hazel looked at the horse with trepidation. Ash was tall and broad, and riding behind Cole was entirely different from controlling the animal herself. "I don't know if I can manage him." "You can't. Not yet. But Ash is smart and he's calm. I'll lead him for now. You just focus on staying in the saddle and getting used to the feel of it." Cole helped her settle into the saddle, adjusting the stirrups for her shorter legs. His hands were matter-of-fact, professional, but Hazel still felt heat creep up her neck at the intimacy of it. "Sit up straight," Cole instructed. "Don't slouch. Heels down, toes up. Hold the reins like this, firm but not tight. The horse can feel your tension, so try to relax." "Relax," Hazel muttered. "Certainly. I'll just forget that I'm alone on the Colorado prairie with a strange man, riding a horse I can barely control, with no idea what's going to happen to me." Cole's mouth twitched. "Well, when you put it that way, I can see how relaxing might be difficult." He took Ash's lead rope and started walking, the horse falling into step beside him. "Talk to me. Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with being abandoned or afraid." Hazel gripped the saddle horn, trying to find her balance as Ash moved beneath her. "Like what?" "Anything. What did you want to be when you were a little girl? What made you laugh? What did you dream about before life got hard?" The question surprised her. No one had asked her things like that in years. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said slowly. "My mother taught me to read when I was 4, and I loved it. Loved the way letters turned into words, and words turned into whole worlds. I used to imagine having my own schoolhouse someday, teaching children to love books the way I did." "Why didn't you?" "Because cholera doesn't care about dreams, and neither did my aunt and uncle. They needed a servant, not a scholar." Bitterness crept into Hazel's voice. "I haven't read anything but my mother's Bible in 4 years. Aunt Martha said reading made women prideful and lazy." Cole glanced back at her, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "Your aunt sounds like a miserable woman who wanted everyone else to be miserable too. That type exists everywhere. They can't stand seeing someone reach for something better because it reminds them they gave up on their own dreams." "You sound like you've met a few." "More than a few. The Army was full of men like that, officers who'd lost their own ambitions and spent their time crushing anyone who still had some." He paused. "But I also met men who kept their humanity in the middle of hell. Men who shared their last rations, who carried wounded soldiers miles under fire, who sang songs in winter camps to keep morale up. The frontier's the same. You get both kinds. The ones who let hardship turn them cruel, and the ones who decide to stay decent anyway." "Which kind are you?" Cole was quiet for a long moment, his boots crunching on the dry earth as he led the horse. "I'm the kind who's trying," he said finally. "Some days I do better than others, but I wake up every morning and decide that today I won't let this hard world make me into something I'd be ashamed of. Today I'll help instead of hurt. Today I'll do right instead of easy." The simple honesty of it made Hazel's chest ache. That's more than most people manage. Maybe, or maybe most people just don't talk about it. They walked and rode in companionable silence for a while, and Hazel gradually felt herself adjusting to the rhythm of the horse beneath her. Cole was right. Ash was calm and steady, and as her fear ebbed, she started to notice other things. The way the saddle creaked with each step, the warm smell of horse rising up around her, the vast openness of the land stretching in every direction, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Around midday, Cole called another halt. They'd reached a spot where a larger creek cut through the prairie, lined with cottonwood trees that offered precious shade. Cole helped Hazel down from the saddle, and she stumbled slightly when her feet hit the ground, legs stiff from hours of riding. "You'll get used to it," Cole assured her, leading Ash to the water. "Give it a few days, and you'll be riding like you were born to it." Hazel doubted that, but she appreciated the encouragement. While Cole tended to the horse, she walked to the creek's edge and knelt, cupping water in her hands to drink. It tasted of minerals and earth, nothing like the well water she'd grown up with, but it was clean and cold and exactly what she needed. "We'll rest here for an hour," Cole announced, settling into the shade of a cottonwood. "Let Ash recover. Let the worst heat pass. This afternoon we'll push harder, try to make up some distance." Hazel joined him in the shade, grateful to be out of the relentless sun. She pulled the daguerreotype of her parents from her pocket. Somehow she'd managed to keep it safe through everything, and studied their young faces. Her mother's slight smile, her father's serious eyes. They looked so hopeful, so certain the future would be kind. "They'd be proud of you," Cole said quietly. Hazel looked up, surprised. "What makes you say that? You never knew them." "I know they raised a daughter brave enough to survive being abandoned, smart enough to accept help when it was offered, and strong enough to keep going when most people would have given up. That doesn't happen by accident. That's the result of good parents teaching their child to value herself." Tears pricked at Hazel's eyes. "I don't feel very brave. Mostly I just feel terrified." "Brave and terrified aren't opposites," Cole said. "Brave is being terrified and doing it anyway. Cowardice is letting fear make your choices for you." He stretched his legs out, crossing them at the ankles. "You want to know what real cowardice looks like? It looks like your aunt and uncle, abandoning a girl to the wilderness because taking care of her was inconvenient. It looks like that bastard at the way station, forcing himself on someone weaker because he could. It looks like every person on that wagon train who watched it happen and said nothing." "You're angry," Hazel observed. "Damn right I'm angry. I've seen too much cruelty dressed up as necessity, too many strong people preying on weak ones and calling it natural, too many cowards hiding behind excuses." Cole removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair, and Hazel noticed how tired he looked, lines around his eyes, a weariness that went deeper than lack of sleep. "The war taught me that most evil doesn't announce itself with grand speeches. It just shows up in small abandonments, little betrayals, everyday cruelties that people excuse because stopping them would be uncomfortable." "Is that why you stopped? When you saw me?" "Part of it." Cole replaced his hat, pulling it low against the sun. "Also stopped because I've been on the other side of it. After the war ended, I came home to find my farm burned, my father dead, and my sister broken. And I knew that somewhere along the line, people must have seen what was happening, must have heard her screaming, must have had a choice to intervene or look away. And they looked away." He paused, jaw tight. "I swore then that I'd never be the person who looked away. Never be the man who rode past someone who needed help because it wasn't convenient. So when I saw you standing there alone, surrounded by your scattered belongings, looking like the end of the world had just happened, yeah, I stopped. Because if I hadn't, I'd be just another coward, and I've got enough to answer for without adding that to the list." Hazel didn't know what to say to that level of raw honesty. Instead, she reached across the space between them and briefly touched his hand, just a moment of contact, there and gone. Cole's eyes met hers, and something passed between them that didn't need words. They rested in the shade while Ash grazed nearby, and Cole shared more of the dried beef and hard biscuits that seemed to be his primary provisions. Hazel was beginning to understand that this was his life, moving from place to place, sleeping on the ground, eating whatever could be carried or caught. It was so different from anything she'd known that it might as well be a different world. "Do you ever want to settle somewhere?" she asked. "Build something permanent?" Cole considered the question. "Sometimes. Then I remember that permanent things can be taken away. Homes burn, people die. The only thing you really own is what you can carry and what you know. Everything else is temporary." "That's a lonely way to live." "Yeah," Cole agreed softly. "It is." When the hour had passed, they resumed their journey. This time Hazel rode without Cole leading Ash, though he walked close beside them, ready to intervene if the horse spooked. Hazel focused on everything he'd taught her: posture, hand position, reading the animal's movements. It was harder than it looked, requiring constant attention and adjustment, but there was satisfaction in feeling herself improve even slightly. The afternoon stretched long and hot, and the landscape began to change in subtle ways. The grass grew shorter, the ground rockier. In the distance, Hazel could see dark shapes that might have been hills or mountains. It was hard to tell, with the heat shimmer distorting everything. "We're making good progress," Cole observed, shading his eyes to scan ahead. "If we keep this pace, we should reach the Huerfano River by tomorrow afternoon. There's usually game there, and better water. We can—" He stopped mid-sentence, his body going suddenly still in a way that made Hazel's heart jump. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Cole's hand moved to his gun, not drawing it but resting on the grip. "Riders," he said quietly. "Coming from the northwest, 3 of them, maybe 4. Hazel looked in the direction he indicated and saw nothing but empty prairie. "I don't see anyone." "You will. They're about 2 miles out, riding hard." Cole's jaw tightened. Could be cowboys, could be drifters, could be trouble. Out here you assume the worst and hope for the best. Fear spiked through Hazel's chest. "What do we do?" "We keep moving, stay alert, and see what they want. But Hazel—" Cole looked up at her, his pale blue eyes sharp and serious. "If things go bad, if I tell you to run, you run. Don't argue, don't look back, just dig your heels into ash and ride as hard as you can toward those hills. Understand? I'm not leaving you to—" "Understand?" Cole's voice had gone hard as iron. Hazel swallowed and nodded. "I understand." "Good." Cole's hand stayed on his gun as they continued forward, but now his whole body radiated tension, coiled and ready. "Probably nothing, but probably isn't certainty." The riders materialized out of the heat shimmer like ghosts becoming solid, and as they drew closer, Hazel could make out details. 4 men, all armed, all riding with the kind of carelessness that spoke of confidence or cruelty or both. They weren't headed directly toward Cole and Hazel, but their path would intersect soon enough. Cole brought them to a halt and waited, positioning himself slightly in front of Ash. Hazel noticed how his stance had shifted, weight on the balls of his feet, shoulders squared, gun hand loose and ready. This was a different Cole than the one who'd joked with her about coffee and taught her to ride. This was the cavalryman, the soldier, the man who'd survived a war. The riders slowed as they approached, spreading out slightly, a formation, Hazel realized with growing dread, designed to surround. The man in the center was older than the others, maybe 40, with a scarred face and eyes that assessed Cole and Hazel like a merchant evaluating merchandise. "Well now," he drawled, reining in about 20 feet away. "What do we have here? Cowboy and his pretty lady out for a ride?" Cole's expression remained neutral, but Hazel heard the edge in his voice when he spoke. "Just passing through. No trouble intended." "No trouble intended," the scarred man repeated, grinning. "Hear that, boys? The man intends no trouble. That's real polite." His eyes shifted to Hazel, traveling slowly over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Where you headed?" "Pueblo," Cole said flatly. "Like I said, just passing through." "Pueblo's a long way from here. Dangerous country for a man traveling alone with a woman. All sorts of unsavory types out here." The man's grin widened. "You might want to consider some insurance, protection-like." "I can protect what's mine," Cole said, and there was something in his tone that made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. The scarred man's grin faded. "That's so? See, thing is, we've been riding hard and haven't had much luck lately. So when we see a man with a nice horse, good gear, and a woman who looks like she might be worth something, well, we start thinking about how we might improve our fortunes." Hazel felt her blood turn to ice. She'd heard stories around the wagon train campfires, tales of outlaws and bandits who preyed on travelers, who took what they wanted and left bodies for the buzzards. She'd thought they were exaggerations meant to scare children. She'd been wrong. "You're thinking wrong," Cole said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're thinking I'm easy prey because I'm outnumbered. You're thinking that girl up there is frightened and helpless. You're thinking you can take what you want and ride away clean." "Sounds about right," the scarred man agreed. "Then you're about to learn a hard lesson." Cole's hand shifted slightly on his gun. "I fought for 3 years in the Union cavalry, took a bullet at Chickamauga, another at Chattanooga, survived the siege of Atlanta. I've killed men in battle, and I've killed men in self-defense, and I've lost count of both numbers. So before you decide to make this a gunfight, ask yourself, are you willing to die today? Because at least 2 of you will, if you push this, maybe all 4. And for what? A horse and some gear? The confidence in the scarred man's face wavered slightly. Behind him, the other riders shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't going the way they'd planned. "Big talk from one man," the scarred man said, but his voice had lost its swagger. "Not talk. Promise." Cole's eyes were winter cold. "I'm offering you a choice. Ride away now, and we all live to see tomorrow, or make the stupid choice and see what happens. But decide fast, because my patience just ran out." The tension stretched so tight Hazel thought it might snap. Her hands gripped the saddle horn until her knuckles went white, and she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. 4 against 1. The odds were terrible. Cole would die trying to protect her, and then she'd... The scarred man spat into the dirt and jerked his chin toward his companions. "Come on, crazy bastard's not worth the trouble." "Smart choice," Cole said softly. They rode away, though not before the scarred man looked back once, his expression promising this wasn't over, just postponed. Hazel watched them disappear into the prairie, her whole body shaking with delayed fear. "Are they really gone?" she managed. "For now." Cole's voice was tight. "But they might circle back after dark, or follow us at a distance. Either way, we need to move fast and cover our tracks." He looked up at her, and his expression softened slightly. "You did good, Hazel. Stayed calm. Didn't panic. That matters." "I was terrified." "I know, so was I. But we're alive and they're gone, so we win." Cole started walking again, faster now, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "We'll push hard till sundown, find a defensible place to camp, somewhere with good sightlines and our backs protected." Hazel's voice came out small. "Will they really come back?" "Maybe. Men like that, pride matters more than sense sometimes. I embarrassed him in front of his crew. That's the kind of thing that festers." Cole's jaw set. "But I meant what I said. I'll protect you, Hazel. Whatever it takes." They traveled hard for the rest of the afternoon, and Cole's wariness infected Hazel until she found herself jumping at every sound, seeing threats in every shadow. The prairie that had seemed beautiful that morning now felt hostile, full of hidden dangers and malicious intent. As the sun began its descent, Cole led them to a rocky outcropping that rose from the prairie like an island from the sea. It wasn't much, maybe 15 feet high, with scattered boulders that could provide cover, but it was the best defensive position Hazel had seen all day. "We'll camp here," Cole announced. "No fire tonight, can't risk the smoke giving away our position. Cold camp, quiet, and we take turns keeping watch." Hazel dismounted on shaking legs, exhausted and frightened and trying not to show either. Cole moved around the rocks with purpose, checking sight lines, finding the best positions for watching approaches. When he was satisfied, he helped Hazel settle into a protected spot between 2 large boulders. "You'll sleep here," he said. "I'll be just above you, watching. If anything happens, you stay low and quiet. Let me handle it." "Cole, I need you to trust me on this, Hazel. I know what I'm doing. I've survived worse situations with worse odds." He touched her shoulder briefly, a gesture meant to comfort. "Try to sleep if you can. Tomorrow we'll push hard for the Huerfano River. Once we cross that, we're within a day of Pueblo. Almost there." Almost there. The words should have been encouraging, but they felt impossibly far away. Hazel wrapped herself in the blanket, Cole's blanket, the one he'd given her the first night, and tried to make herself small and invisible between the rocks. Above her, Cole settled into his watch position, and Hazel could just barely see his silhouette against the darkening sky. He sat utterly still, gun in hand, scanning the prairie with the patience of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. Hazel closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but every sound jerked her awake. The wind through the rocks, a nightbird calling, the distant yip of coyotes. Hours passed in slow agony, and she wondered how Cole could maintain such vigilance, such focus. Sometime deep in the night, she heard him shift position, and his voice came down to her, barely a whisper. "Still awake?" "Can't sleep," Hazel admitted. "Too afraid." "Yeah, I remember that feeling. First night after my first battle, I couldn't close my eyes. Kept seeing all the things that almost killed me, kept hearing the guns." He paused. "It gets easier. Not the fear. That never goes away. But you learn to function alongside it. Learn to do what needs doing, even when you're scared." "Were you scared this afternoon? With those men?" Cole was quiet for a moment. Terrified? 4 against 1, with you to protect? Yeah, I was scared. But I've learned that scared men can still pull triggers, still make choices. Fear doesn't have to be paralysis. Sometimes it's just the price of doing the right thing. Thank you, Hazel whispered, for being afraid but staying anyway. She heard him shift again, and when he spoke, his voice held something that might have been surprise. Nobody's ever thanked me for that before. Then people are idiots. Cole's quiet laugh drifted down to her. Get some sleep, Hazel. I've got watch. Eventually, despite everything, exhaustion claimed her. Hazel drifted into uneasy sleep, her dreams full of wagon trains and cold-eyed men, an endless prairie that swallowed people whole. She woke once to find Cole still watching, still vigilant, outlined against a sky full of stars. The sight of him there, solid, reliable, committed to keeping her safe, let her slip back into sleep with something almost like peace. When dawn came, pink and gentle, Hazel woke to find Cole already moving, packing their gear with quiet efficiency. His face was drawn with exhaustion, dark circles under his eyes, but his movements were sure and steady. You didn't sleep at all, Hazel realized, horrified. Slept enough. It was clearly a lie. We need to move. I want to put distance between us and anyone who might be tracking us. They broke camp quickly, eating dried meat as they walked. Cole helped Hazel into the saddle, and this time he climbed up behind her, reversing their usual arrangement. You'll ride in front today, he explained. I can watch our back trail better this way, and you've gotten good enough to handle Ash with me here to help. It was awkward at first, having Cole's arms around her as he held the reins, his chest against her back. But Hazel found she didn't mind the closeness. It felt safe, protective, like being surrounded by a fortress made of bone and muscle and unwavering determination. They rode hard all morning, stopping only briefly to water Ash at a small creek. Cole's eyes never stopped moving, constantly checking behind them, scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. His vigilance was exhausting to witness. Hazel couldn't imagine maintaining it for hours, much less the days he'd been traveling. Do you see them? She asked once. The men from yesterday? No, but that doesn't mean they're not there. Cole's voice was tight. Could be they gave up and moved on. Could be they're hanging back, waiting for us to relax. No way to know until we reach Pueblo. By mid-afternoon, the landscape had changed significantly. The ground grew hillier, studded with rocks and scraggly juniper trees. In the distance, Hazel could see actual mountains. The Rockies, she realized. The massive range she'd heard about but never seen. The Huerfanos just ahead, Cole said, and she heard relief in his voice. Once we cross that, it's 20 miles to Pueblo. We might make it by tomorrow afternoon if we don't run into trouble. The river, when they reached it, was broader and faster than the creeks they'd crossed before. The water ran brown with sediment, and the current looked strong enough to sweep a person away. Can we cross? Hazel asked nervously. We'll see. Cole dismounted and led Ash to the water's edge, studying the flow with experienced eyes. It's high for mountain runoff, but there's a ford about a quarter-mile upstream, shallow enough for the horse if we're careful. They followed the riverbank until Cole found what he was looking for, a place where the water spread wide and ran over a gravel bed. He remounted behind Hazel and urged Ash forward into the current. The horse balked at first, nervous about the rushing water, but Cole's steady voice calmed him. Easy, boy. You've done this before. Just take it slow. The water rose around Ash's legs, then his belly, cold and fast and powerful. Hazel felt the horse's muscles bunch beneath her as he fought to keep his footing on the slippery rocks. Cole's arms tightened around her, holding her secure, and she realized he was prepared to grab her if the horse went down. Almost there, Cole murmured, though whether he was talking to Hazel or the horse, she couldn't tell. Then they were across, water streaming from Ash's legs, and Hazel let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Well done, Cole said, and she wasn't sure if he meant her or the horse, but it didn't matter because they were safe and across, and one obstacle closer to civilization. They rode on through the afternoon, and gradually Hazel noticed signs of human presence. An old campfire site, wagon ruts in the earth, a crude marker made of stacked stones. Civilization was close. Safety was close. The nightmare was almost over. As the sun began to set, Cole found another rocky spot to make camp, though this one felt different, less like a fortress, more like simple shelter. He helped Hazel down from the saddle, and she saw the exhaustion in every line of his body. "You need to sleep tonight," she told him firmly. "Really sleep. I'll keep watch." Cole started to protest, but Hazel cut him off. "You taught me what to look for. I may not be as good as you, but I can watch for a few hours while you rest. You're no good to either of us if you collapse from exhaustion." Something shifted in Cole's expression, surprise maybe, or gratitude. "You sure?" "I'm sure. You've done nothing but protect me for 2 days straight. Let me do something useful for once." So that night, after a cold meal of dried meat and the last of the hard biscuits, Cole actually lay down and closed his eyes, while Hazel kept watch from a position between two rocks. She sat with his gun across her lap. He'd shown her how to use it, though she prayed she wouldn't have to, and scanned the darkness for threats. The prairie at night was alive with sound and movement, but Hazel had learned to distinguish normal from dangerous. Coyotes calling to each other? Normal. Nightbirds hunting? Normal. The rustle of small animals in the grass? Normal. It was the silences that worried her, the sudden cessations of sound that might mean a predator was near. But the night passed quietly, and when dawn came, Cole woke with a start, looking around wildly before remembering where he was. "You let me sleep," he said, accusation and wonder mixed together. "You needed it." Hazel handed him the gun back. Everything was quiet. No bandits, no wolves, nothing but me and the stars. Cole took the gun, but he was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he said finally, "for watching, for trusting yourself enough to do it. You taught me well." They broke camp as the sun climbed, and Cole's movements had regained some of their usual efficiency. A night's sleep had restored him, and Hazel felt a small glow of pride that she'd been the one to give him that. "Today we reach Pueblo," Cole announced as they mounted Ash together, Hazel in front again, Cole behind. "Real beds, real food, and safety. You ready for that?" Hazel thought about it. Safety meant civilization, which meant questions about who she was and why she was traveling alone with a man. It meant facing an uncertain future without Cole's steady presence. It meant the end of this strange, terrifying, somehow precious journey. "I don't know," she admitted. "Is that strange?" "No." Cole's arms tightened briefly around her in something that might have been a hug. "Out here it's just us against the world. In town it gets complicated, rules and expectations and people judging. I get why you'd be nervous." "What happens when we get there? To us, I mean." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "I'll make sure you're settled somewhere safe. Find you a place at a boarding house, maybe. Introduce you to some decent folks who can help you figure out what comes next. Then," he paused, "then I'll move on, I suppose. That's what I do." The thought of him leaving made Hazel's chest ache in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. "What if I don't want you to move on?" The words hung in the air between them, bold and honest and terrifying. Cole didn't answer immediately, and Hazel wondered if she'd crossed some invisible line, said something she shouldn't have. "Hazel," he said finally, his voice rough, "you've been through hell. You're grateful and scared, and I'm the only person who's shown you kindness lately. That's not the same as wanting me to stay. Once you're safe and settled, once you've had time to think clearly, you might feel different. And if I don't, then we'll talk about it." Cole urged Ash forward. "But first, let's get you to Pueblo, one crisis at a time." They rode toward the distant town, toward safety and civilization and whatever future waited there. And Hazel leaned back against Cole's chest and tried not to think about what it would feel like when he finally let her go. Pueblo appeared on the horizon like a mirage made solid, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden structures clustered along the Arkansas River, smoke rising from chimneys, the blessed signs of human civilization after days of empty prairie. Hazel felt her heart lift at the sight, then immediately sink as she remembered what reaching town meant. Cole would leave. This strange, intense companionship born of necessity would end, and she'd be alone again in a different way. "There it is," Cole said quietly behind her. "We made it." They'd been riding since dawn, covering the final 20 miles with determination bordering on desperation. Both of them were exhausted, filthy from days of trail dust, and Hazel knew she must look like something the cat dragged in. Her dress was wrinkled and stained, her hair escaping its braid in wild tangles, her face probably sunburned beyond repair. But they were alive. Against odds that had seemed impossible 3 days ago, they were alive and whole and entering a town where help waited. Cole guided Ash down the main street, and Hazel felt eyes turning toward them, curious gazes from men lounging outside a saloon, suspicious looks from women hanging laundry, the frank stares of children who recognized strangers when they saw them. She knew what they were seeing, a cowboy and a bedraggled woman riding together on one horse, clearly having traveled far and rough. She knew what they were thinking, too, and felt heat climb her neck that had nothing to do with the sun. Cole seemed oblivious to the stares, or perhaps he was just accustomed to them. He rode straight to a sturdy 2-story building with a sign that read Sheriff's Office, and dismounted with that easy grace Hazel had come to recognize. He helped her down, his hands steady on her waist, and she stumbled slightly when her feet hit solid ground. 3 days of constant riding had left her legs uncertain. "Wait here with Ash," Cole instructed. "I need to report those men we encountered. Sheriff needs to know there's bandits working this territory." He disappeared into the office before Hazel could protest, leaving her standing awkwardly on the street beside the horse. She tried not to notice the continued stares, the whispers between 2 women across the street, the way a merchant in a doorway looked her up and down with obvious disapproval. Cole emerged 15 minutes later with a solidly built man in his 50s, wearing a badge and an expression of concern. The sheriff's eyes went to Hazel, assessing her with the kind of professional scrutiny she imagined he used on everyone. "Miss Thornton," Cole said, "this is Sheriff Dan Kowalski." "Sheriff, this is Hazel Thornton, the woman I told you about." "Ma'am," the sheriff said, touching his hat. His voice was gruff but not unkind. "Mr. Maddox here tells me you had some trouble on the trail. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you hurt?" "No, sir. Mr. Maddox ensured I came to no harm." The sheriff's eyes flicked between them, and Hazel saw him drawing conclusions, making judgments. "I see. And these men who threatened you, you're certain there were 4 of them?" "Yes, sir," Cole answered. Leader had a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. About 40 years old, rode a paint horse. The others were younger, less distinctive. They were armed and looking for easy prey. Sheriff Kowalski's expression darkened. "That sounds like the Barlow gang. We've had reports of them working territory between here and the Kansas border. Mean sons of—" He caught himself, glancing at Hazel. "Apologies, ma'am. Mean men. Dangerous. You're lucky Mr. Maddox was there." "I'm aware," Hazel said quietly. The sheriff studied Cole with renewed interest. "Maddox. That name's familiar. You're the cavalryman who testified against the Dawson brothers last year, sent them to prison." Something shifted in Cole's posture, a tension Hazel hadn't seen before. "That was me." "Brave thing you did. Those boys had half the territory scared silent." The sheriff paused. "Of course, it also means you made enemies. Dawson brothers have friends, and friends have long memories." "I'm aware of that too," Cole said flatly. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Hazel remembered how Cole had recognized the threat in those 4 riders immediately, how he'd positioned himself for combat without hesitation. She'd thought it was just experience, but now she understood it was something more. He was a marked man, living with the knowledge that violence could find him anywhere, anytime. Sheriff Kowalski turned his attention back to Hazel. "Miss Thornton, do you have family in Pueblo? Anyone expecting you?" "No, sir. I have no one." The simple truth of it seemed to surprise him. "Where were you headed before your troubles?" Hazel straightened her spine, calling on the last reserves of her dignity. "I was traveling with a wagon train. My aunt and uncle were headed to Colorado seeking opportunity. They decided I was too much of a burden and left me on the prairie to fend for myself." The sheriff's expression went from surprise to anger. "They what?" "Abandoned her," Cole said, his voice hard. 3 days ago, about 40 miles northeast of here. Left her with a broken trunk and no provisions. If I hadn't come along, she'd be dead." Sheriff Kowalski's jaw worked as if he were chewing on words too harsh to speak in front of a lady. "That's criminal. That's attempted murder, is what that is. You have names? Wagon train master?" Samuel Pritchard was the wagon master, Hazel said. My aunt and uncle were Martha and Silas Thornton. But I don't want to press charges, Sheriff. I just want to start over. Miss Thornton, please. Hazel met his eyes steadily. They made it clear I'm not wanted. Pursuing legal action would only tie me to them longer. I'd rather they disappear from my life completely. The sheriff looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Hazel's expression must have convinced him. He nodded slowly. Your choice, ma'am. But if you change your mind, the offer stands. He glanced at Cole. What are your plans now, Maddox? Find Miss Thornton somewhere safe to stay. Make sure she's settled. Then I'll move on. Move on where? Cole shrugged. Wherever work is. I heard there might be ranch jobs south of here toward New Mexico territory. Sheriff Kowalski was quiet for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. Before you go rushing off, come by my office tomorrow morning. I might have a proposition for you. Pueblo's growing fast, and I could use a deputy who knows how to handle trouble. Pay's not great, but it's steady, and you'd have a place to sleep that's not the ground. Cole's surprise was evident. I'm not really the settling type, Sheriff. Maybe it's time you became it. Think about it. The sheriff touched his hat to Hazel. Ma'am, there's a boarding house 2 streets over run by Mrs. Eleanor Everett. Tell her I sent you. She's got a good heart, and she'll see you're treated right. And if you need anything at all, you come find me. Understand? Yes, sir. Thank you. The sheriff headed back into his office, leaving Cole and Hazel standing in the street with Ash between them. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly, and Hazel suddenly felt the weight of 3 days without proper sleep, without real food, without any certainty about her future. Come on, Cole said gently. Let's get you to that boarding house. They walked through Pueblo's streets, Cole leading Ash while Hazel tried not to stumble with exhaustion. The town was bigger than she'd expected. Maybe 200 buildings, streets laid out in a rough grid, the kind of place that was growing too fast to be orderly. She saw a general store, a bank, a hotel, 2 saloons, a church with a white steeple, a schoolhouse that made her heart ache with longing. Mrs. Everett's boarding house was a neat 2-story structure with a covered porch and flower boxes in the windows, small touches of domesticity that spoke of a woman who cared about appearances. Cole tied Ash to the hitching post and followed Hazel up the steps. Before they could knock, the door opened to reveal a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pinned in a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She looked at Cole, then at Hazel, and her expression shifted from suspicion to concern. Good heavens, child, she said, addressing Hazel. You look like you've been through a war. Come in, come in. And you, sir? She pointed at Cole. You can explain yourself in the parlor. They were ushered inside to a clean, comfortable room, furnished with worn but well-maintained furniture. Mrs. Everett disappeared and returned moments later with water and clean cloths, which she handed to Hazel with a no-nonsense efficiency. Wash your face and hands while this gentleman tells me how you came to be in such a state, she instructed. Cole explained, his words economical and factual. Hazel washed the trail dust from her skin and listened to him recount their journey, the abandonment, the encounter with bandits, the 3-day ride to safety. Mrs. Everett's expression grew progressively more horrified. Those people should be horsewhipped, she declared when Cole finished. Leaving a girl alone on the prairie like that. It's unconscionable, she turned to Hazel. You poor dear, but you're safe now. I have a room available, small but clean, $3 a week for room and board, meals included. Can you manage that? Hazel's heart sank. I have no money, Mrs. Everett. I have nothing but what I'm wearing and a few belongings Mr. Maddox carried for me. I see. Mrs. Everett's expression softened. Well, we'll figure something out. I could use help around here, cooking, cleaning, mending. If you're willing to work, we can apply your labor against the room cost until you get on your feet. I'm very willing to work, Hazel said quickly. I'm a hard worker, ma'am. I can cook and clean and mend. I can do laundry, tend gardens, anything you need. Can you read and write? Yes, ma'am. My mother taught me. Mrs. Everett's eyebrows rose. Well-educated, too. That's unusual for a frontier girl. Might be you could find teaching work if you're interested. The schoolhouse has been looking for help since Mrs. Patterson's health started failing. Hope flared in Hazel's chest, hot and sudden, and almost painful. Teaching. Her childhood dream, the thing she'd thought lost forever. I would love that. I've always wanted to teach. We'll look into it. Mrs. Everett stood and brushed off her skirts. For now, let me show you to your room. You can rest and clean up properly. There's a bath down the hall. I'll have my girl heat water for you. Mr. Maddox. She fixed Cole with a stern look. You're welcome to visit Miss Thornton here during calling hours, which are between 2 and 5 in the afternoon. Any other time would be improper. I run a respectable house. Understood, ma'am. Cole stood as well, turning to Hazel. I'll come by tomorrow afternoon if that's all right. Make sure you're settling in. Hazel wanted to grab his hand, to beg him not to leave yet, but she forced herself to nod calmly. Thank you for everything, Cole. I owe you my life. Something flickered across his face, an emotion too complex to name. You don't owe me anything, Hazel. I'm just glad you're safe. He left then, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and Hazel felt his absence like a physical thing, a sudden cold where warmth had been, an emptiness where protection had stood. Mrs. Everett showed her upstairs to a small room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out onto the street. It was simple and spare, but it was clean and safe and more than Hazel had dared hope for 3 days ago. I'll have Mary bring up hot water, Mrs. Everett said. Take your time, dear. Wash up, rest, and come down for supper at 6. We eat as a household. There are 4 other boarders currently, all women, all respectable. You'll fit in fine. When she was alone, Hazel sank onto the bed and let herself shake. The journey was over. She was safe. Cole had kept his promise, had delivered her to civilization and people who would help. This was what she'd needed, what she'd been desperate for. So why did it feel like she'd lost something precious? The hot bath that arrived an hour later was a luxury Hazel had almost forgotten existed. She scrubbed days of trail dust from her skin and hair, watching the water turn brown with grime. Mary, the boarding house girl, had brought up Hazel's trunk. Cole must have arranged it before he left. And Hazel changed into her spare dress, which was hardly better than the one she'd been wearing, but at least it was clean. Supper was an overwhelming affair. The other boarders were pleasant but curious. A widow named Mrs. Carson, 2 young women who worked at the general store, and an older woman named Miss Pritchard who taught piano lessons. They all wanted to know about Hazel, where she'd come from, how she'd ended up in Pueblo. Hazel gave them an edited version that left out the worst details. She could see Mrs. Everett watching her carefully, perhaps judging how much truth to allow, but the landlady said nothing to contradict her. After supper, exhausted beyond measure, Hazel excused herself and returned to her small room. She lay in the narrow bed, so strange after 3 nights on the ground, and stared at the ceiling while her mind spun with everything that had happened. 4 days ago, she'd been part of a wagon train, believing she had some kind of future, however bleak. 3 days ago, she'd been abandoned, certain she would die. 2 days ago, she'd been riding behind a stranger through hostile territory. Yesterday, she'd watched that stranger face down 4 armed men to protect her. And today she was alone in a boarding house in a town she'd never seen, entirely dependent on the kindness of strangers, with no clear path forward. But alive. Against all odds, impossibly alive. Sleep claimed her suddenly, dragging her down into darkness so complete she didn't dream. She woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from below. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, and panic seized her. Then memory returned and she relaxed into the mattress. Safe. She was safe. The day passed in a blur of activity. Mrs. Everett put Hazel to work immediately, sweeping, dusting, helping with laundry. The work was familiar and oddly comforting, giving her hands something to do while her mind processed everything. The other boarders were kind, including her in their conversations, treating her like she belonged. At 2 o'clock, Hazel positioned herself near the front windows, trying not to be obvious about watching for Cole. Mrs. Everett noticed and gave her a knowing smile, but said nothing. Cole arrived at 2:30, riding Ash and looking more rested than Hazel had seen him. He'd cleaned up too, shaved, changed into a shirt that wasn't covered in trail dust, though he still wore his gun low on his hip like a man who expected trouble. Mrs. Everett showed him to the parlor and stationed herself in a chair by the door, a chaperone making sure propriety was observed. Hazel appreciated it even as she chafed against the restriction. She wanted to talk to Cole privately, to say things that couldn't be said with Mrs. Everett's sharp ears listening. "You look better," Cole observed, settling into a chair across from her. "Rested." "So do you. Did you find a place to stay?" "Hotel for now. Nothing fancy, but the bed's better than the ground." He paused. "I went to see Sheriff Kowalski this morning about that deputy position." Hazel's heart jumped. And I'm thinking about it. It's steady work, which I haven't had in years. And Pueblo seems like a decent town. Growing, but not lawless. Could be worse places to settle for a while. "Only for a while?" Hazel heard herself ask. Cole met her eyes, and something passed between them that made the air feel charged. "That depends on a lot of things." Mrs. Everett cleared her throat pointedly, and Hazel remembered they weren't alone. She forced herself to look away from Cole, to gather her scattered thoughts. "Mrs. Everett mentioned there might be teaching work available," she said, trying for normalcy. "The schoolhouse needs help." "That's perfect for you." Cole's voice held genuine pleasure. "You'd be a good teacher, Hazel. Patient and smart and kind. Kids would be lucky to have you." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. "I'm meeting with the school board tomorrow. I'm terrified they'll take one look at me and see an abandoned girl with no references and no credentials. They'll see a woman who survived impossible odds with grace and courage," Cole said firmly. "They'll see someone who wants to make a difference. And if they don't, they're fools." Mrs. Everett cleared her throat again, louder this time. "Mr. Maddox, I believe you mentioned wanting to ensure Miss Thornton was properly settled. Perhaps you could assist her with a matter of business." Cole looked confused. "What kind of business?" The landlady stood and produced a piece of paper from her pocket. "Miss Thornton needs to officially register her arrival in Pueblo with the town clerk, for census purposes and such. It would be proper for her to have an escort for such an errand, and as you brought her here, you're the logical choice. I'll accompany you both, naturally." Hazel understood immediately. Mrs. Everett was giving them a reason to spend time together under the guise of propriety. She shot the older woman a grateful look. They walked to the town clerk's office, Mrs. Everett maintaining a discreet distance that allowed Cole and Hazel to talk without being overheard. The afternoon sun was warm, but not oppressive, and Pueblo bustled with activity. Wagons rumbling past, merchants hawking wares, children playing in the street. "Are you really thinking about staying?" Hazel asked quietly. "Taking the deputy job?" Cole was silent for several steps. "I'm thinking about a lot of things. About being 30 years old and having nothing to show for it but scars and memories. About spending my whole life moving from place to place, never building anything, never belonging anywhere." He glanced at her. "About whether it's possible for someone like me to have something different." "What would different look like?" "I don't know. A job that matters? A place to call home? Maybe—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "Maybe someone to share it with, eventually." Hazel's breath caught. She knew they were talking around something, circling it without naming it directly. The attraction between them was undeniable, had been since that first day when he'd offered her food and safety without asking for anything in return. But attraction born of crisis was different from attraction that could survive normal life, wasn't it? "Cole," she said carefully, "you don't owe me anything. You saved my life, and I'll be forever grateful, but you don't have to stay in Pueblo because of some misplaced sense of responsibility toward me." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his pale blue eyes intense. "What if it's not about responsibility? What if it's about wanting to stay?" Before Hazel could respond, Mrs. Everett materialized at her elbow. "The clerk's office is just ahead, dear. Let's get this business done before they close for the day." The moment shattered, and they continued walking. But Hazel's heart was racing, and when Cole's hand briefly brushed hers, accidentally or deliberately, she couldn't tell, electricity shot through her. The clerk's office was a small, stuffy room filled with ledgers and forms. A harried-looking man took Hazel's information, name, age, previous residence, reason for coming to Pueblo. When he asked about family, she said simply, "None." The word felt both truthful and terrifying. As they were leaving, they nearly collided with a well-dressed man entering, 50s, gray hair, expensive suit. He stopped when he saw Cole, and his face lit up with recognition. "Cole Maddox, I heard you were in town. Mayor Harrison, we met last year when you testified against the Dawsons."
Cole shook his hand. Mr. Mayor, good to see you. The pleasure's mine. Sheriff Kowalski tells me he's trying to recruit you as deputy. I hope you'll accept. We need good men in this town, and your reputation precedes you. The mayor's eyes shifted to Hazel, curious and assessing. And who is this young lady? Miss Hazel Thornton, Cole said. She's new to Pueblo, looking to make a fresh start. Wonderful, wonderful. We need good people as much as we need good lawmen. The mayor's expression turned thoughtful. Miss Thornton, forgive my presumption, but Sheriff Kowalski mentioned you might be educated.
Is that true? I can read and write, sir. My mother was a teacher before she married. Excellent. The school board has been desperate for help. Our current teacher, Mrs. Patterson, is struggling with 60 students and failing health. We've been trying to find an assistant, but qualified candidates are rare on the frontier. He pulled a card from his pocket and handed it to Hazel. Come see me tomorrow morning at 10. I'm on the school board. We'll discuss possibilities. He tipped his hat and disappeared into the clerk's office, leaving Hazel staring at the card in her hand with something approaching disbelief. See? Cole said softly. Told you they'd see what you're worth. They walked back to the boarding house as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. Mrs. S. Everett maintained her discreet distance, and Hazel found herself acutely aware of every detail. The way Cole's shadow fell across hers, the sound of his boots on the wooden boardwalk, the careful space he maintained between them to preserve propriety. At the boarding house steps, he stopped and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I'm going to take the deputy job, he said. Sheriff wants me to start Monday. That gives me 4 days to decide if this is really what I want, but I think it is. He paused. I'm staying in Pueblo, Hazel, at least for a while, and I'd like permission to call on you proper-like, during visiting hours, with chaperones, doing things the right way. Hazel's heart soared and plummeted simultaneously. This was what she wanted, Cole staying, the possibility of something real between them, but doubt crept in like poison. Cole, you barely know me. We spent 3 days together under extreme circumstances. How do you know what you're feeling is real and not just aftermath, crisis bonding? I don't, Cole admitted. Neither do you. But I know I want to find out, don't you? Before Hazel could answer, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. 4 riders were coming down the main street, moving with deliberate purpose. Even from a distance, Hazel recognized the man in the lead, the scarred face, the paint horse. The Barlow gang had found them. Cole's hand went to his gun in one smooth motion, his entire body shifting into combat readiness. Get inside, he told Hazel, his voice deadly calm. Now, tell Mrs. Everett to lock the doors and stay away from windows. Cole, now, Hazel! She ran up the steps and through the door, calling for Mrs. Everett. Behind her, she heard the riders pull to a stop, heard the scarred man's voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. Maddox, we need to talk. Hazel peered through the parlor window, her heart in her throat. Mrs. Everett appeared at her shoulder, taking in the scene with a sharp intake of breath. That's trouble, the landlady said grimly. Cole stood alone in the street, facing 4 armed men with a calmness that seemed almost supernatural. I said everything I needed to say 2 days ago. You boys should have kept riding. The scarred man, Barlow, Hazel assumed, laughed without humor. See, that's where you're wrong. You embarrassed me in front of my crew. Can't let that stand. Bad for business. So you rode all the way to Pueblo to salvage your pride? That's poor decision-making, Barlow. You know my name. Good. Then you know I don't make idle threats. Barlow's hand rested on his gun. You're going to apologize for your disrespect, and you're going to pay compensation for my trouble. That girl and the horse ought to cover it. Cole's laugh was cold as winter. You're out of your mind if you think that's happening. Then we've got a problem. The street had gone silent. Hazel could see people disappearing into buildings, mothers pulling children inside, merchants stepping back from doorways. Everyone recognized what was about to happen. A gunfight. Right here on Pueblo's main street. You've got 4 seconds to get out of town, Cole said, his voice carrying authority Hazel had never heard before. 1, you can't count us all down, Maddox. 2, one of the younger riders shifted nervously in his saddle. Jake, maybe we should...
"Shut up," Barlow snapped. Then to Cole, "You're bluffing. One man can't take 4. 3. The sheriff's office door opened and Sheriff Kowalski stepped out, shotgun in hand. A moment later, 2 deputies emerged from the general store across the street, rifles leveled. The odds had just shifted dramatically. 4, Cole finished. "Sheriff, these men threatened me and Miss Thornton on the trail 2 days ago. They've now followed us to Pueblo with violent intent. I believe that constitutes a crime."
"It surely does," Kowalski said, his shotgun never wavering. "Boys, you got 2 choices. You can dismount peaceful-like and spend a night in jail while we sort this out, or you can try something stupid and end up in the Undertaker's care. Your call." Barlow's face had gone red with rage, but he wasn't stupid enough to fight 6-4 odds in the middle of town. "This isn't over, Maddox." "Yeah, it is." Cole's voice held finality. "Because you're going to spend tonight in jail, and tomorrow Sheriff Kowalski is going to escort you to the county line with a message. Come back to Pueblo and you'll hang. Sheriff's quite serious about keeping his town peaceful. Aren't you, Sheriff?" "Dead serious," Kowalski agreed. "Now dismount. Nice and slow." The Barlow gang complied, though their leader's eyes promised murder. The deputies moved in to disarm them, and Cole finally relaxed his stance. He glanced toward the boarding house, and even from a distance, Hazel could see the concern in his eyes. She ran back outside, propriety forgotten, and nearly threw herself at him. "You could have been killed." Cole caught her shoulders gently. "But I wasn't, and they won't be back, not after tonight. The sheriff will make sure of it." He looked over her head at Mrs. Everett, who'd followed Hazel outside. "I'm sorry for bringing trouble to your door, ma'am." "Nonsense," Mrs. Everett said briskly, though her hands shook slightly. "You protected Miss Thornton in this town from dangerous men. That's the opposite of trouble, Mr. Maddox. That's heroism." She fixed him with a stern look. "Though I expect once you're officially a deputy, you'll be better equipped to handle such situations." Cole's mouth quirked. "Yes, ma'am. I'll start Monday." The crowd that had been watching from buildings began to emerge, and several people approached Cole to shake his hand or thank him. Hazel stepped back, watching how naturally he accepted their gratitude while deflecting praise to the sheriff and deputies. This was who Cole Maddox was, she realized. Not just a man who'd saved her from abandonment, but someone who stood between ordinary people and danger as naturally as breathing. Someone who could have walked away from trouble but chose to face it instead. Someone worth building a life around. When the crowd finally dispersed and the excitement faded, Cole walked Hazel back to the boarding house steps. The sun had set during the confrontation, and the first stars were appearing overhead. "You asked earlier if I knew what I was feeling was real," Cole said quietly. "Hazel, I've known a lot of women. Some I liked, some I cared for, some I forgot as soon as I rode away. But in 3 days with you, I learned what I'd been missing. Courage that doesn't quit. Kindness that survives cruelty. Intelligence that questions everything, including me. And somewhere in those 3 days, I started imagining what it would be like to have that in my life permanently." Hazel's eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. "I feel the same way, but Cole, we have to be smart about this. You're taking a deputy job. I'm hopefully getting teaching work. We need to build our own lives first, prove we can stand on our own, and then..." She took a breath. "Then we can figure out what we might build together." Cole smiled, a real smile, open and hopeful. "That's the smartest thing I've heard all day. So here's my proposal. I'll take the deputy job, you'll take the teaching job. We'll court proper-like with chaperones and visiting hours and doing everything by the book. And in 6 months, we'll know if this is real or just aftermath." 6 months, Hazel agreed. "That seems reasonable." "Reasonable," Cole echoed. Then he did something that made Hazel's breath catch. He took her hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was both chaste and full of promise. 6 months, Hazel Thornton, and then we'll see." He left her standing on the steps, her hands still tingling from his kiss, her heart full of possibility for the first time since her parents died. Mrs. Everett appeared in the doorway, her expression knowing. "That man's going to marry you," she said matter-of-factly. "We barely know each other," Hazel protested weakly. "Doesn't matter. I've been watching people fall in love for 40 years, and I know what it looks like. He's already yours, dear. The next 6 months are just formality." The landlady smiled.
Now come inside. Tomorrow you have a meeting with the mayor, and you'll want to be well rested and presentable. Your whole future starts tomorrow."
Hazel followed her inside, and for the first time since the wagon train abandoned her, she let herself believe in that future. Not just survival, but possibility. Not just safety, but joy. Not just existing, but living. The girl who'd been left to die on the Colorado prairie was gone, replaced by a woman who'd survived, who'd been brave enough to trust, who'd found her way to a new beginning. And the cowboy who'd said, "You'll ride with me now," had kept his promise. He'd brought her through danger to safety, through fear to hope, through abandonment to something that felt remarkably like home. The story was far from over. But for the first time, Hazel was excited to see what the next chapter held. Meant. Part 4. Hazel woke before dawn on the morning of her meeting with the mayor, her stomach twisted with nerves and anticipation. She dressed in her best dress, which wasn't saying much, considering her limited wardrobe, and did her hair 3 times before she was satisfied with the simple bun at the nape of her neck. Mrs. Everett took one look at her over breakfast and disappeared upstairs, returning with a delicate lace collar. "This was my daughter's," the landlady said, fastening it around Hazel's neck. "She's married now and living in Denver, has no use for such things anymore. But you're about to meet the school board, and first impressions matter. You'll wear this and hold your head high, and you'll show them exactly what kind of teacher you'll be." Hazel touched the collar with trembling fingers. "I can't accept this. It's too fine." "You can and you will. Consider it an investment in Pueblo's future. If you get this position, you'll be teaching my grandchildren someday, God willing." Mrs. Everett's eyes were bright with emotion. "Now eat your breakfast. You'll need your strength." The walk to the mayor's office felt endless and too short all at once. Hazel had rehearsed what she might say a dozen times in her head, but every planned speech felt inadequate. What could she possibly tell them that would overcome the fact that she had no experience, no references, no credentials beyond her mother's patient teaching years ago? The mayor's office was in the same building as the town clerk, a modest structure that served multiple civic functions. Mayor Harrison greeted her warmly and led her to a conference room where 4 other people waited, 2 men and 2 women, all looking prosperous and serious. "Miss Thornton, allow me to introduce the school board," the mayor said. "Mrs. Catherine Walsh, who owns the hotel. Mr. Robert Chen, our banker. Reverend Thomas Crawford, who ministers at the church. And Mrs. Patricia Donovan, whose husband runs the largest ranch in the county." Hazel shook hands with each of them, trying to keep her own from trembling. They gestured for her to sit, and she perched on the edge of a wooden chair while 5 pairs of eyes studied her with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. Mrs. Walsh spoke first. "Mayor Harrison tells us you're interested in the teaching assistant position. Tell us about your educational background." Hazel took a breath and chose honesty over embellishment. "My formal education came from my mother, who was a teacher in Illinois before she married. She taught me reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and history from the time I was 4 years old. I can parse Latin and do advanced mathematics. I've read extensively Shakespeare, Milton, the Greek classics, American history, natural philosophy. My mother believed that education was the foundation of a meaningful life, and she made sure I had every advantage she could provide." "And your mother now?" Reverend Crawford asked gently. "Dead, sir. Cholera took both my parents 4 years ago. Since then, I've had little opportunity to continue my studies, but I haven't forgotten what I learned. And more importantly, I haven't forgotten how my mother taught, with patience and enthusiasm, making each lesson an adventure rather than a chore." Mr. Chen leaned forward. "Miss Thornton, we're a frontier town struggling to provide education to our children. We have 60 students ranging from age 5 to 15, all crammed into one schoolhouse with one teacher who's trying her best but is overwhelmed and unwell. What makes you think you can handle such a challenge?" It was a fair question, and Hazel met his gaze steadily. "Because I understand what it means to have education and lose it, sir. I know what it's like to hunger for knowledge and be denied access. Every child in that schoolhouse deserves someone who remembers what that feels like, who will fight to make sure they have opportunities I was denied. I may not have experience, but I have dedication. And I believe that matters more." Mrs. Donovan's expression had softened. "How old are you, dear?" 20, ma'am." "Quite young."
And you came to Pueblo under unusual circumstances, I understand. Hazel had known this question would come. Yes, ma'am. I was traveling with family who decided they no longer wished to support me. I was abandoned on the prairie and would have died if not for the intervention of Mr. Cole Maddox, who brought me safely to Pueblo. I arrived here with nothing, no money, no connections, no prospects. But I'm willing to work hard to build a life here. Mrs. Everett has given me room and board in exchange for housework, and I'm hoping this position might allow me to become self-sufficient. The board members exchanged glances, communicating in the silent language of people who'd worked together for years. Finally, Mayor Harrison spoke. Miss Thornton, I'm going to be frank with you. Normally, we'd require references, preferably from other educational institutions. We'd want to observe you teaching before making a decision. We'd want assurances about your character and stability. He paused. But we don't have the luxury of normal circumstances. Mrs. Patterson is 63 years old and exhausted. She's threatening to quit at the end of this month if we don't find her help. We've advertised the position for 6 months with no qualified applicants because educated women don't generally venture to frontier towns. What the mayor is trying to say, Mrs. Walsh interjected, is that we're desperate. And you, despite your youth and unconventional arrival, are the first person we've interviewed who can actually read and do mathematics. So we're prepared to offer you a trial period. Hazel's heart leaped. A trial period? 2 months, Reverend Crawford said. You'll work as Mrs. Patterson's assistant, helping with the younger students primarily. We'll pay you $15 a month, not much, but combined with your arrangement at Mrs. Everett's, it should allow you to live modestly. At the end of 2 months, we'll evaluate your performance and decide whether to make the position permanent. And if you prove yourself capable, Mr. Chen added, we'll increase your salary to $25 a month. Eventually, when Mrs. Patterson retires, you might even take over as head teacher if you're interested. Hazel could barely breathe. This was more than she'd dared hope for. Not just a job, but a future, a purpose, the chance to do something meaningful with her life. I accept, she said, then worried she'd been too hasty. That is, if you're offering the position, Mayor Harrison smiled. We are. Can you start Monday? Yes, sir, absolutely. They spent the next hour discussing logistics, school hours, curriculum expectations, discipline policies, the supplies she'd have access to at FAS. Walsh explained that she'd need to dress modestly and maintain propriety at all times, as the teacher was expected to be a moral example for the community. Reverend Crawford emphasized the importance of including religious instruction. Mr. Chen wanted assurance that she could teach practical mathematics, not just theory. Hazel absorbed it all, her mind racing with possibilities and plans. When the meeting finally concluded, she walked out of the building in a daze, barely able to believe what had just happened. She had a real job doing something she'd always dreamed of. In the space of 4 days, she'd gone from abandoned and dying to employed and hopeful. The transformation was so complete it felt like being reborn. Mrs. Everett was waiting on the boarding house porch when Hazel returned, her face expectant. Well, I got it, Hazel said, her voice breaking. I start Monday. The landlady's whoop of joy brought the other boarders running, and suddenly Hazel was surrounded by women congratulating her, asking questions, offering advice. It was overwhelming and wonderful and utterly foreign, this sense of belonging, of being celebrated rather than tolerated. That afternoon, precisely at 2 o'clock, Cole arrived for his visit. Hazel met him in the parlor with Mrs. Everett stationed in her usual chaperoning position, and the moment she saw his face, she knew he had news too. I heard, he said, grinning. Mayor couldn't wait to tell the sheriff that they'd finally found a teacher. I'm proud of you, Hazel. I'm terrified, she admitted. 60 students, Cole. What if I can't handle them? What if I'm terrible at this? You won't be. You'll be exactly what those kids need. He settled into his chair, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. I have news too. I officially start as deputy tomorrow. Sheriff's already got me scheduled for patrols, and he wants me to help with training the volunteer fire brigade. Apparently deputies wear multiple hats in small towns. That's wonderful. Are you nervous? A little. It's been a long time since I had to answer to anyone or follow someone else's rules. But Sheriff Kowalski seems like a good man. Fair, competent, not on any power trips. I could do worse.
They talked for the allotted hour, carefully skirting around the deeper feelings that simmered beneath every word. Mrs. Everett's presence ensured propriety, but it also created a strange tension. Everything Hazel wanted to say had to be edited, filtered, made appropriate for public consumption. When Cole rose to leave, he hesitated at the door. "Hazel, I know we agreed to take this slow, to do things properly, but I want you to know that starting tomorrow, we're both going to be busy, really busy. Teaching and law enforcement aren't exactly leisurely professions, so we'll have to work to make time for each other." "I know, and we will." Hazel managed to smile despite the worry gnawing at her. "We survived 3 days of hell together, Cole. We can survive being busy." "Yeah," he agreed. "We can." But as he walked away, Hazel felt the first stirrings of doubt. The crisis that had thrown them together was over. Now came the harder test, building something real in the ordinary world, with all its demands and distractions and complications. Monday arrived with the weight of new beginnings. Hazel woke before sunrise, dressed in her most conservative dress, and walked to the schoolhouse with a stomach full of butterflies. The building was larger than she'd expected. A single room with high windows, rows of wooden benches, a blackboard at the front, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner. Mrs. Patterson was already there, a thin woman with white hair and tired eyes that lit up when Hazel entered. "Oh, thank God," the older teacher breathed. "You're real. I was half convinced the board made you up to keep me from quitting." She extended a hand that trembled slightly. "Sarah Patterson. And you must be my salvation." "Hazel Thornton. Though I'm not sure about salvation. I've never actually taught before." "You can read and write and showed up on time. That puts you ahead of most frontier applicants." Mrs. Patterson gestured around the room. "It's chaos. I won't lie to you. 60 children of wildly different ages and abilities, all crammed together. I've been trying to teach reading to the 5-year-olds while the 15-year-olds cause trouble in the back. I'm exhausted. My health is failing, and I was about to quit and move back to St. Louis to live with my daughter. But now you're not? Now I have help, or at least I hope I do." Mrs. Patterson's expression turned serious. "Here's what I'm thinking. You take the youngest children, ages 5 through 8. There are about 20 of them. Teach them letters, basic reading, simple arithmetic. I'll handle the older students. We'll divide the room with a curtain I've been meaning to hang for months. It won't be perfect, but it'll be better than what we have now." Hazel nodded, trying to ignore the panic rising in her chest. 20 children. She'd be responsible for 20 children. What if she failed them? What if she was as bad at this as she'd been at pleasing Aunt Martha? Mrs. Patterson must have seen something in her face because she touched Hazel's arm gently. "First-day nerves are normal, dear. I still get them sometimes, and I've been teaching for 40 years. But let me give you the advice my own teacher gave me. Children can sense fear, but they can also sense love. If you care about them genuinely, if you want them to succeed, they'll forgive a multitude of mistakes." The children arrived in a flood of noise and energy, and Hazel's anxiety spiked to new heights. They ranged from tiny 5-year-olds who could barely reach the benches to lanky 15-year-olds who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Some were clean and well-dressed. Others were clearly from poorer families, wearing patched clothes and worn shoes. Mrs. Patterson called for order with a firmness that came from decades of practice, and gradually the chaos settled into something manageable. She introduced Hazel to the class, explaining the new arrangement, and Hazel tried not to notice the skeptical looks from some of the older boys. "Miss Thornton will be teaching our younger students," Mrs. Patterson announced. "You will treat her with the same respect you show me. Anyone who doesn't will answer to me, and you all know what that means." Several students looked chastened, and Hazel suspected Mrs. Patterson had a reputation for discipline that bordered on legendary. The morning was baptism by fire. Hazel gathered her 20 charges, a squirming, chattering group that included 2 sets of twins, one boy who refused to stop making animal noises, and a tiny girl who burst into tears the moment her mother left. Hazel had no idea what she was doing, so she fell back on what she remembered from her own childhood. "My name is Miss Thornton," she said, pitching her voice to carry without shouting. "Can everyone say that? Miss Thornton?" A ragged chorus of Miss Thornton came back at her, though the animal noise boy added several moos for good measure. "Good. Now, who here can tell me a story? Any story at all? Hand shot up immediately. Children, Hazel discovered, loved to talk about themselves. For the next hour, she let them share stories about their families, their pets, their favorite foods, anything they wanted. She listened to each one attentively, asking questions, making them feel heard. And slowly, the skepticism in their young faces softened into tentative trust. When story time ended, she moved to letters, using the blackboard to write the alphabet in large, clear script. Some of the children already knew their letters, others were seeing them for the first time. Hazel worked with each child individually, praising effort over perfection, making games out of learning. By the time noon recess arrived, she was exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. The children tumbled outside to eat their lunches, and Hazel collapsed onto a bench beside Mrs. Patterson. "You're a natural," the older teacher observed. "I've been watching. Those children already adore you." "I have no idea what I'm doing," Hazel confessed. "None of us do, dear. We just pretend really well." Mrs. Patterson smiled. "You'll be fine. Better than fine. Give it a month and you'll wonder how you ever did anything else." The afternoon brought arithmetic and geography, and Hazel discovered that teaching was perhaps the hardest work she'd ever done, not physically, but mentally and emotionally. Every child needed something different. Some needed encouragement, others needed discipline. Some learned quickly, others needed patient repetition. And all of them needed her to care, to see them as individuals rather than a collective burden. By the time 3 o'clock arrived and the children scattered to their various homes, Hazel felt like she'd run a marathon. Mrs. Patterson patted her shoulder sympathetically. "First day is always the worst. Tomorrow will be easier. And by the end of the week, you'll have a routine established." The older teacher gathered her things. "Same time tomorrow, Miss Thornton, and try to get some rest tonight. You'll need it." Hazel walked back to the boarding house in a daze, her mind still full of children's faces and voices. She'd done it. She'd survived her first day of teaching. It hadn't been perfect. The animal noise boy had tested her patience repeatedly, and she'd stumbled over several explanations. But she'd done it. Mrs. Everett had supper waiting, and over roast chicken and potatoes, the other boarders peppered Hazel with questions about her first day. She answered as best she could, warmed by their genuine interest, their support. That evening, precisely at 6 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Everett answered it and returned with a small package. "For you, dear, from Mr. Maddox." Hazel opened it to find a book, a primer for teaching young children, worn but useful, and a note in Cole's angular handwriting. "Saw this at the general store and thought of you. Congratulations on surviving day 1, only a few thousand more to go." See, the gesture was so thoughtful, so perfectly timed, that Hazel felt tears prick her eyes. He'd been thinking of her. In the midst of his own first day as deputy, dealing with his own challenges, he'd taken time to find something that might help her. She penned a quick thank you note and gave it to Mrs. Everett to deliver the next time Cole visited, then spent the evening poring over the primer, making notes about lessons she might try with her students. The days began to blur together in a pattern that was exhausting and satisfying in equal measure. Hazel woke early, taught all day, returned to the boarding house to help Mrs. Everett with chores, then spent her evenings planning lessons and grading simple assignments. Cole visited during calling hours whenever his deputy duties allowed, and they talked about their respective challenges: difficult students and difficult drunks, curriculum debates, and petty theft investigations. Their relationship developed in small increments, constrained by propriety, but deepening nonetheless. Cole brought her wildflowers he'd picked on patrol. Hazel mended a tear in his shirt when he mentioned he couldn't afford the seamstress. They attended church together on Sundays, always properly chaperoned by Mrs. Everett, and afterward walked to the river to talk where others could see them, but not over here. Weeks passed, then a month. Hazel's trial period was halfway over, and she'd found her rhythm with the children. The animal noise boy, Tommy, had become one of her favorites, his energy channeled into acting out vocabulary words with dramatic flair. The crying girl, Lucy, now greeted her each morning with a hug. The skeptical older students in Mrs. Patterson's section had started asking Hazel for help with their reading, acknowledging her skill, if not her authority. She was becoming a teacher, really and truly, and it felt like coming home to a place she'd never been but had always belonged. Cole, meanwhile, was proving himself an excellent deputy. Sheriff Kowalski sang his praises regularly. How Cole had diffused a potential riot at the saloon without violence. How he'd tracked down a stolen horse using cavalry skills. How children on the street called out greetings to Deputy Maddox with obvious affection. They were both building lives in Pueblo, creating identities beyond the abandoned girl and the wandering cowboy. And Hazel could feel something shifting between them, the crisis bond evolving into something deeper, more sustainable, more real. But there were challenges, too. Cole's past occasionally caught up with him. Men he'd testified against had friends and families who held grudges. Hazel overheard whispers among some of Pueblo's less savory residents about that cavalry snitch and worried for his safety. And Cole worried about her too, though he tried to hide it. She'd catch him watching the schoolhouse from across the street sometimes, making sure no trouble found her. One evening in late October, 2 months after their arrival in Pueblo, Cole visited the boarding house with a serious expression that made Hazel's stomach knot with worry. "Is everything all right?" she asked once they were settled in the parlor under Mrs. Everett's watchful eye. "Yeah, no, maybe." Cole ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Hazel had learned meant he was wrestling with something important. "Hazel, I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how you'll take it." Fear spiked through her. "What is it?" "Sheriff Kowalski got word from the federal marshal. The Dawson brothers, the outlaws I testified against last year, they're being transported to the territorial prison next week. The route passes near Pueblo, and there's concern their associates might try to free them." Cole's jaw tightened. "The marshal requested that I join the escort, since I know the brothers and their tactics. It's a 3-day job. Ride out Monday, back Thursday if all goes well." "And if all doesn't go well?" "Then it takes longer, or—" He didn't finish, but Hazel understood. "Or it ends badly, or Cole doesn't come back." Mrs. Everett cleared her throat from her corner. "Perhaps Miss Thornton and I should discuss this privately, Mr. Maddox. Give the young lady a moment to process." But Hazel shook her head. "No, I want to hear this from Cole." She looked at him steadily, pushing down her fear. "Why are you telling me this? You don't owe me explanations about your work." "Don't I?" Cole's pale blue eyes were intense. "Hazel, we've been courting for 2 months now, properly, carefully, taking it slow like we agreed. But somewhere in those 2 months, this stopped being an experiment to see if what we felt was real. For me, at least. It became something I'm building my life around." Hazel's breath caught. "Cole, I'm not asking for promises or commitments. I know we said 6 months, and I'm willing to honor that. But I need you to know, if something happens on this escort detail, if I don't come back, I need you to know that you changed everything for me. You made me believe I could have something beyond survival. You made me want to stay in one place, build something permanent, become someone worth—" "Stop!" Hazel's voice came out fiercer than she intended. "Don't talk like you're not coming back. You're a skilled cavalryman and an excellent deputy. You're going to do this job and you're going to come back safely, and we're going to continue courting for the remaining 4 months like we planned." Cole's expression softened. "You sound very certain." "I am certain, because you promised me 6 months, Cole Maddox, and you're a man who keeps his promises." Hazel felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. "So you go do this dangerous job because it's the right thing to do and because people are counting on you, and then you come back to me. Understand?" Something shifted in Cole's face, surprise giving way to something that looked like wonder. "Yes, ma'am. I understand." Mrs. Everett sniffled audibly from her corner, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "You young people are going to be the death of me. All this emotion before supper time." Cole left shortly after, and Hazel spent the rest of the evening trying not to think about all the things that could go wrong on a prisoner escort through hostile territory. She threw herself into lesson planning with desperate focus, as if keeping her mind occupied could somehow keep Cole safe. Sunday came, and they attended church together as usual. Reverend Crawford's sermon was about faith in uncertain times, about trusting God's plan even when the path ahead looked dark. Hazel tried to take comfort in the words, but mostly she just watched Cole from the corner of her eye, memorizing details. The way his hair curled slightly at his collar, the small scar on his jaw she'd never asked about,
the capable strength in his hands as he held the hymnal. After the service, they walked to their usual spot by the river, Mrs. Everett trailing at a discreet distance. The October air had turned crisp, hinting at winter's approach, and the cottonwood leaves were starting to yellow. "I leave tomorrow before dawn," Cole said, skipping stones across the water with practiced ease. "Should be back Thursday afternoon if everything goes according to plan." "What are the odds everything goes according to plan?" "Better than you'd think. The Dawsons have enemies, but they're not particularly organized, and the marshal has 6 men, including me. We're prepared for trouble." He sent another stone skipping, 5 bounces before it sank. "Hazel, if something does happen, it won't. But if it does, you need to know that Mrs. Patterson and the school board think you're excellent. They're going to offer you the permanent position when your trial period ends next week. I talked to the mayor. You'll be fine financially. And Mrs. Everett has agreed to let you stay at the boarding house for reduced rent since you're teaching. You'll be taken care of." Hazel turned to face him fully. "You've been planning my future without me. I've been making sure you're protected if I can't be here to do it myself." Cole's voice was gentle but firm. "That's what you do when you care about someone. You make sure they're safe, even if you're not around." The simple declaration, "when you care about someone," hung in the air between them. It wasn't quite, "I love you," but it was close enough to make Hazel's heart race. "I care about you too," she said quietly, "which is why you need to be careful tomorrow. Come back safe, Cole. Please." He looked at her for a long moment, and Hazel saw him wrestling with something. Finally, he stepped closer. Not inappropriately close, but near enough that she could feel the warmth of him, smell the soap he'd used that morning. "When I get back," he said softly, "I want to talk about the future. Our future, specifically. Is that all right?" Hazel's throat felt tight. "We still have 4 months left on our agreement." "I know, and I'll wait if that's what you want. But Hazel, I think I already know how I feel. I think I've known since that first night on the prairie when you kept watch so I could sleep. When you trusted yourself enough to protect me the way I'd been protecting you." He paused. "I'm not asking for an answer now. I'm just asking permission to ask the question when I return." "What question?" Hazel's voice was barely a whisper. Cole smiled, slow and warm. "The only question that matters." He didn't elaborate, but he didn't need to. They both knew what he meant, and Hazel found herself nodding, giving permission for a future she'd barely dared imagine. Monday morning came too quickly. Hazel didn't go to see Cole off. It wasn't proper, and besides, he'd leave before sunrise. Instead, she went to the schoolhouse and threw herself into teaching with renewed determination. If Cole could be brave enough to face dangerous outlaws, she could be brave enough to teach fractions to 8-year-olds. The days dragged with agonizing slowness. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Each evening, Hazel returned to the boarding house hoping for news and finding none. Mrs. Everett tried to distract her with extra chores and cheerful conversation, but worry had taken up permanent residence in Hazel's chest. Thursday afternoon arrived, and Hazel dismissed her students early, claiming she needed to prepare for the end of her trial period evaluation. In truth, she couldn't concentrate on teaching while waiting to hear if Cole had returned safely. She was helping Mrs. Everett prepare supper when they heard the commotion outside. Horses, raised voices, the sound of a crowd gathering. Hazel's heart leaped into her throat, and she ran to the window. The prisoner escort had returned. She could see 6 riders surrounded by curious townspeople, and in the center of the group, still in the saddle, was Cole. He looked exhausted and dusty, but whole, gloriously, wonderfully whole. Hazel barely remembered running down the stairs and out the door, propriety completely forgotten. She pushed through the crowd until she reached Ash's side, looking up at Cole with eyes that she knew revealed too much. "You're back," she said unnecessarily. Cole swung down from the saddle, wincing slightly as his feet hit the ground. "Told you I would be." His smile was tired but genuine. "Had a bit of trouble about 20 miles out, ambush attempt, just like we expected, but nothing we couldn't handle. Prisoners are secure and headed to the territorial prison. Mission accomplished." "Were you hurt?" Hazel's eyes scanned him for injuries. "Few bruises, nothing serious." He glanced around at the crowd watching them with undisguised interest.
This probably isn't the time or place, but when I'm cleaned up and rested, can I call on you? Properly? At the boarding house? Yes. Of course. Tonight if you're able. Tonight, Cole agreed. Sheriff Kowalski appeared, clapping Cole on the shoulder with obvious pride. Good work, Deputy. Take the rest of the day to recover. I'll see you back on duty tomorrow. The crowd gradually dispersed, and Hazel walked back to the boarding house in a daze. Mrs. Everett met her at the door with a knowing smile. He's back safe. You can stop worrying now. Now I'm worried about tonight, Hazel admitted. He wants to talk about the future, Mrs. Everett. Our future. And how do you feel about that? Hazel thought about the past 2 months, teaching children who needed her, building a life in a community that had welcomed her, falling deeper in love with a man who'd saved her in more ways than one. I feel like I'm ready, she said. Whatever he wants to talk about, I'm ready to hear it. That evening, Cole arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, freshly washed and shaved, wearing clean clothes and an expression that was equal parts nervous and determined. Mrs. Everett showed him to the parlor and took her usual chaperoning position, though Hazel noticed the older woman had positioned herself slightly farther away than normal, giving them as much privacy as propriety allowed. You look better, Hazel observed. Less like you've been fighting outlaws. Feel better, too. Nothing like a hot bath and clean shirt to restore a man's spirits. Cole sat across from her, his hands clasped between his knees. Hazel, I've been thinking a lot over the past few days about what I want, where I'm going, what kind of life I want to build. And what did you decide? Cole looked at her with those pale blue eyes that had first appeared through the heat shimmer on the prairie 2 months ago. I decided that I'm tired of moving, tired of being alone, tired of surviving instead of living. He paused. The truth is, I fell in love with you somewhere between that first night and this one. Maybe it was when you trusted me enough to ride with a stranger. Maybe it was when you kept watch so I could sleep. Maybe it was watching you become an amazing teacher despite being terrified. I don't know exactly when it happened, but I know it did. Hazel's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear over it. Cole, I know we agreed to wait 6 months, and if you need the full 6 months, I'll wait. I'll wait a year if that's what you need. But Hazel Thornton, I need you to know that when I think about my future, you're in every version of it. And I'm praying that when you think about your future, maybe I'm in it too. The parlor had gone absolutely silent. Even Mrs. Everett seemed to be holding her breath. Hazel stood up, and Cole immediately stood as well, uncertainty flickering across his face. She crossed the small space between them, propriety be damned, and took his hands in hers. Cole Maddox, I fell in love with you when you appeared on that prairie like an answer to a prayer I didn't know I was praying. And every day since then I've fallen a little bit deeper. Teaching has given me purpose, and Pueblo has given me community, but you've given me hope. You've shown me what it means to be chosen instead of abandoned, to be protected instead of discarded, to be loved instead of tolerated. Cole's hands tightened on hers. Hazel, so if you're asking what I think you're asking, the answer is yes. To whatever future we can build together. Yes. For a moment, Cole just stared at her, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. Then he did something that made Mrs. Everett gasp. He pulled Hazel close and kissed her, right there in the boarding house parlor, with all propriety abandoned in favor of pure joy. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning, Mrs. Everett was on her feet, tears streaming down her face. I suppose I should scold you both for such impropriety, she said, dabbing at her eyes. But honestly, I've been waiting 2 months for this. Congratulations, you foolish, wonderful young people. When's the wedding? Cole looked at Hazel, his expression full of wonder and happiness. Soon, he said. If Hazel agrees. I don't want to wait any longer than we have to. How soon is soon? Hazel asked, her own smile so wide it hurt. As soon as Reverend Crawford can arrange it. End of October, maybe? That gives us 3 weeks to do things proper. Announce our engagement. Let you finish your trial period and get the permanent teaching position. Give people time to get used to the idea. 3 weeks. It seemed impossibly fast and achingly slow all at once. But Hazel nodded because waiting any longer than necessary to start their life together felt like torture. End of October, she agreed. Cole Maddox, you're going to make me the happiest woman in Pueblo. Not half as happy as you've made me, Cole replied, pulling her close again despite Mrs. Everett's token protest about propriety. And Hazel leaned into his embrace, feeling safe and chosen and loved, all the things she'd thought she'd lost forever when the wagon train rolled away. She'd been left behind to die, but instead she'd found life. Real life, full of purpose and possibility, and a love that had grown from crisis into something strong enough to last. The girl who'd stood alone on the prairie was gone. In her place was a woman who'd survived, who'd become a teacher, who'd found her place in a frontier town and a home in the heart of a cowboy who'd said, "You'll ride with me now," and meant it forever. News of the engagement spread through Pueblo like wildfire. By Friday morning, Hazel couldn't walk down the street without receiving congratulations from merchants, students' parents, and townspeople she'd never even met. The romance of it all had captured the town's imagination. The abandoned girl rescued by the cowboy, both building new lives in Pueblo, now planning to marry after a whirlwind courtship. Mrs. Everett was in her element, planning the wedding with an enthusiasm that was both touching and overwhelming. She'd already consulted with Reverend Crawford about dates, talked to the hotel owner about a small reception, and somehow procured fabric for a wedding dress from a traveling merchant who'd passed through town. "White cotton with lace trim," she announced, spreading the fabric across the dining table for Hazel's inspection. "Simple but elegant. Appropriate for a frontier wedding. I'll sew it myself, with help from the other ladies. You'll be beautiful, dear." Hazel touched the fabric with trembling fingers. A wedding dress. She was going to have a real wedding dress, not just her cleanest dress, pressed and called good enough. The reality of it all kept hitting her in waves. She was getting married. To Cole. In 3 weeks. "Mrs. Everett, this is too much. The fabric alone must have cost—" "Hush, consider it my wedding gift. Every bride deserves to feel special on her wedding day, and you, my dear, deserve it more than most." The landlady's eyes were misty. "When you arrived here 2 months ago, you had nothing. Now look at you, a respected teacher, an engaged woman, someone this whole town has come to admire. I'm so proud of you." The words hit Hazel unexpectedly hard. When was the last time someone had said they were proud of her? Not since her parents died, certainly. Aunt Martha had only ever expressed disappointment. "Thank you," Hazel whispered, embracing the older woman. "For everything. For taking me in, for believing in me, for giving me a home when I had nowhere else to go." "Oh, child," Mrs. Everett said, her voice thick, "you gave yourself a home. I just provided the building." That afternoon, the school board met to discuss Hazel's trial period. She sat in the same conference room where she'd interviewed 2 months ago, trying not to show her nervousness. Mrs. Patterson sat beside her, having insisted on attending to provide her assessment. Mayor Harrison smiled warmly. "Miss Thornton, we've been observing your work closely over the past 2 months. We've heard from parents, visited your classroom unannounced, and consulted extensively with Mrs. Patterson. I'm pleased to say the board is unanimous in our decision." Hazel's heart hammered. "And that decision is?" "We'd like to offer you a permanent position as assistant teacher with an immediate salary increase to $25 per month. Furthermore, Mrs. Patterson has informed us that she plans to retire at the end of this school year. At that time, assuming you're interested, we'd like you to take over as head teacher." Relief and joy flooded through Hazel in equal measure. "Yes, absolutely yes. I'm honored and grateful, and I promise I'll work hard to deserve your trust." Mrs. Walsh, the hotel owner, leaned forward with a knowing smile. "We also hear congratulations are in order. You're marrying Deputy Maddox?" "Yes, ma'am, October 30th. "Wonderful timing," Reverend Crawford said. "That gives you a week to settle into married life before November classes resume. Though I must say, Miss Thornton, you'll need to decide how you wish to be addressed once you're married. Mrs. Maddox, presumably." The name sent a thrill through her. Mrs. Maddox. Hazel Maddox. She'd have a new name, a new identity as a married woman, another layer of distance from the abandoned girl she'd been. "Yes, Mrs. Maddox," she agreed. "Though it'll take some getting used to." The board members chuckled, and Mr. Chen produced a contract for her to sign, official documentation of her permanent employment. Hazel signed with a hand that only trembled slightly, watching her name appear on the paper in ink that wouldn't fade. She had a job, a career, a future that didn't depend on anyone's charity or goodwill, but on her own skills and dedication.
The independence of it was intoxicating. When she left the meeting, she found Cole waiting outside, leaning against the building with Ash's reins in hand. He straightened when he saw her, and the question in his eyes was almost comical. "Well?" "Permanent position, $25 a month, and they want me to become head teacher when Mrs. Patterson retires," Hazel reported, unable to keep the pride from her voice. Cole whooped and picked her up, spinning her around right there on the street despite the scandalized looks from passing ladies. When he set her down, his grin was infectious. "That's my girl. I knew they'd recognize quality when they saw it." He offered his arm. "Walk with me? I have something to show you." They walked through town with Ash trailing behind, and Hazel noticed Cole was leading them away from the main streets toward the quieter residential area on the eastern edge of Pueblo. Small houses dotted the landscape here, modest but well-maintained with gardens and fences and all the markers of established homes. Cole stopped in front of a small cabin, one-story, log construction, with a covered porch and 2 windows facing the street. It was simple but solid, the kind of house a working family might build with their own hands and limited resources. "What do you think?" Cole asked. Hazel looked at the cabin, then at him. "I think it's lovely. Whose is it?" "Ours, if you want it." Cole's voice held a nervous edge she rarely heard from him. "The previous owner moved to Denver last month, and it's been sitting empty. Sheriff Kowalski mentioned it, said the owner wants to sell for a reasonable price. I've been doing extra work, night patrols, helping with construction projects, saving up. Between what I've put aside and the deputy's salary, I can afford it." He led her up to the porch, producing a key from his pocket. "It needs work. Some of the boards are loose, the stove probably needs replacing, and the roof might leak in heavy rain. But it's solid bones, Hazel, a place we could make into a real home." The inside was dim and dusty, but Hazel could see the potential immediately. A main room with a stone fireplace, a smaller bedroom off to one side. A kitchen area with basic counters and shelving. The floors were rough wood that would need sanding, and the walls needed whitewashing, but the space felt right somehow, like it was waiting for people to fill it with life. "There's even a small shed out back," Cole continued, his enthusiasm growing. "I could build you a proper garden come spring, and the bedroom's big enough for a double bed and maybe a cradle eventually, if—" He stopped, color rising in his cheeks. "Well, eventually." Hazel's own cheeks heated at the implication, but she couldn't stop smiling. "Cole, it's perfect, absolutely perfect, but are you sure you can afford it? With both our salaries, we'll manage fine. Won't be luxurious, but it'll be ours. No landlords, no boarding house rules, just us building a life the way we want." He turned to face her fully. "Hazel, I want to give you a home, a real home, where you're not a burden or a guest, but the woman of the house, where you belong completely." The emotion in his voice made Hazel's throat tight. "Show me everything." They walked through the cabin room by room, Cole pointing out what needed fixing and what could stay, Hazel already imagining curtains in the windows and books on shelves and a table where they'd eat meals together. The bedroom had a small window that looked east. They'd wake to sunrise every morning. The kitchen had a pump that actually worked, which Cole demonstrated with obvious pride. "We could move in right after the wedding," he said. "I've already talked to some of the men from church about helping fix the worst problems, and Mrs. Everett said she'd donate some basic furniture she's got stored in her attic, a bed frame, a table, some chairs. It won't be fancy, but—" "Cole?" Hazel stopped his nervous rambling by taking his hands. "It's perfect because it's ours. I don't need fancy. I need home, and this—" She gestured around the dusty cabin. "This is home." The kiss that followed was soft and sweet and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cole rested his forehead against hers. "3 more weeks," he murmured. "I don't know how I'm going to survive 3 more weeks of propriety and chaperoned visits." "The same way I will, by planning our future and counting down the days." Hazel smiled against his cheek. "Though Mrs. Everett might actually murder us if we violate any more social conventions before the wedding. She's very invested in this being a respectable courtship. Bit late for that, considering we spent 3 days alone together on the trail." "Yes, but the town doesn't know that."
They think you very properly brought me straight to the boarding house and maintained appropriate distance at all times. Hazel pulled back to look at him seriously. Cole, people are going to talk. They probably already are. About how quickly we're marrying, about the circumstances of how we met. Some will be kind, others won't. Are you prepared for that? Cole's expression hardened. Let them talk. I know the truth, that you're the bravest, most honorable woman I've ever met, that our courtship has been more proper than half the marriages in this town, and that anyone who has a problem with our wedding can take it up with the deputy who's sworn to keep the peace, which means I'll have to arrest myself for disturbing it by punching them. Despite the tension of the moment, Hazel laughed. Very logical solution. I thought so. Cole locked the cabin door behind them. Come on. I'll walk you back to the boarding house before Mrs. Everett sends a search party. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Hazel taught during the days and spent her evenings helping Mrs. Everett sew the wedding dress, plan the reception, and make lists of everything that needed to be done. The other boarders threw her a small party, gifting her with practical items for her new home. Dish towels, a set of mixing bowls, a hand-stitched quilt. Cole worked double shifts to save extra money and spent every spare moment at the cabin with volunteers from town, fixing the roof, sanding floors, whitewashing walls. Hazel visited when she could, bringing lunch for the workers and watching the house transform from neglected to loved. Sheriff Kowalski proved to be an unexpected source of support, donating a barely used stove and helping install it himself. Every deputy needs a decent home, he declared. Makes for better work when a man's got something to come back to. Mrs. Patterson, who was rapidly becoming one of Hazel's dearest friends despite their age difference, helped her navigate the social complexities of being an engaged woman in a small town. Which events to attend, which invitations to accept, how to graciously deflect the occasional pointed question about the speed of the courtship. Just smile and say you knew immediately when you found the right person, she advised. Most romantic souls will sigh and agree. The cynics will gossip regardless, so you might as well give them something pleasant to work with. A week before the wedding, Hazel received an unexpected visitor at school. A woman in her late 30s, well-dressed and travel-worn, appeared in the doorway during afternoon recess. Miss Thornton, my name is Caroline Pritchard. I wonder if we might speak privately. The name Pritchard sent ice through Hazel's veins. Samuel Pritchard had been the wagon master, the one whose son had looked back when they abandoned her. Was this his wife? Had they come to cause trouble? Hazel dismissed her students for a longer recess and faced the woman with as much composure as she could muster. What can I do for you, Mrs. Pritchard? Caroline Pritchard twisted her hands together, clearly uncomfortable. I came to apologize. And to explain, if you'll let me. Hazel said nothing, waiting. My husband told me what happened. How your aunt and uncle abandoned you, how Samuel wanted to intervene but my husband forbade it. We had words about it, terrible words, the worst argument in 20 years of marriage. Caroline's eyes were red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. I told him it was unconscionable, that we'd left a girl to die, that Christian charity meant nothing if we could do that and sleep at night. But he said the wagon train couldn't afford delays or complications, that your family had made their choice and we had to respect it. And what did you say to that? I said respecting evil is the same as participating in it. Caroline's voice strengthened. Miss Thornton, I didn't know what was happening until it was too late. By the time Samuel told me, we were a day's travel away. I wanted to turn back to find you, but my husband refused. Said we had a schedule to keep and other families depending on us. Hazel felt old anger stirring, mixing with new understanding. Why are you here now, Mrs. Pritchard? Because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to make amends. We completed our journey to the Colorado silver mines, and we've been there 3 months. But I kept thinking about you, wondering if you'd survived, praying you'd found help. Then last week, a traveler mentioned a wedding in Pueblo, a teacher marrying a deputy, both of them newcomers who'd arrived under dramatic circumstances. And I just knew it was you. Caroline reached into her bag and pulled out a small bundle. I brought you something. It's not much, and it doesn't undo what was done. But she unwrapped the bundle to reveal a beautiful hand-stitched quilt, intricate in design and clearly made with skill and care. I made this during the journey. I thought about you with every stitch, about the girl we left behind, about what kind of strength it would take to survive that abandonment, and I prayed you'd find your way to safety and happiness." Hazel stared at the quilt, emotions warring inside her. Part of her wanted to reject the gift, to send Caroline Pritchard away with harsh words about being too little too late. But another part, the part that had grown stronger over the past 3 months, recognized the courage it took to come here, to face the person you'd wronged and offer apology without excuse. "Does my aunt know you're here?" Hazel asked finally. "No, and I don't plan to tell her. Martha Thornton is—" Caroline paused, choosing words carefully. "She's a bitter woman who takes her disappointments out on anyone weaker than her. I tried to befriend her on the journey, but she made it clear she wanted no part of Christian fellowship. I'm sorry you had to live with that for 4 years. So am I." Hazel took the quilt, running her hands over the careful stitching. "Thank you for bringing this, and for apologizing. It doesn't erase what happened, but it matters that you cared enough to try." Caroline's eyes filled with tears. "You survived. And more than survived, you've thrived. That teacher who abandoned you, she didn't destroy you. She just freed you to become who you were meant to be." The observation was surprisingly profound, and Hazel found herself nodding. She did, though I wouldn't recommend her method. They talked for a few more minutes, and Caroline shared news from the wagon train, who'd struck silver, who'd failed, who'd turned back. When she finally left, Hazel stood holding the quilt and marveling at how strange life was. The people who should have protected her had abandoned her, and now a virtual stranger had traveled days to offer apology and a handmade gift. That evening, she showed the quilt to Cole during his visit. He examined it carefully, his expression thoughtful. "You going to use it?" he asked. "I think so. It's too beautiful not to, and holding on to anger seems exhausting." Hazel folded the quilt carefully. "Besides, she's right in a way. Being abandoned by my aunt was the worst thing that ever happened to me, but it was also the thing that led me to you, to teaching, to this life. I can't regret the outcome, even if I hate how I got here." Cole pulled her close. They were in the parlor with Mrs. Everett chaperoning, but the older woman had started allowing slightly more affection as the wedding approached. "You're a better person than I am. I still want to find your aunt and uncle and give them a piece of my mind." "No, you don't. You want to move forward with our life, not backward into my past." Hazel kissed his cheek. 5 more days, Cole, 5 more days, and we'll be married." 5 days too many," he muttered, but he was smiling. The wedding day arrived with perfect October weather, crisp air, brilliant sunshine, and cottonwood leaves turning gold along the river. Hazel woke in her small room at the boarding house for the last time, knowing that tonight she'd sleep in her own home as Cole's wife. The thought filled her with equal parts excitement and terror. Mrs. Everett brought her breakfast in bed, a luxury she'd insisted on despite Hazel's protests. "Every bride deserves to be pampered on her wedding day. Eat, then we'll get you dressed. The ceremony's at 2 o'clock, which gives us plenty of time." The other boarders helped with preparations, doing Hazel's hair in an elegant upswept style and fussing over every detail of the white cotton dress. When Hazel finally looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The frightened girl who'd arrived in Pueblo 3 months ago had been replaced by a confident woman in a beautiful dress, ready to start a new life. "You're stunning," Mrs. Carson breathed. "Deputy Maddox is going to forget how to speak when he sees you." The church was packed when Hazel arrived. It seemed the entire town had turned out for the wedding. She recognized students and their parents, fellow teachers, merchants, even the mayor. Sheriff Kowalski stood at the front with Cole, serving as best man, and Mrs. Patterson waited in a front pew to stand as Hazel's witness. But Hazel only had eyes for Cole. He stood at the altar in a new suit, probably the first suit he'd owned in years. His dark hair neatly combed, his expression a mixture of awe and joy as he watched her walk down the aisle. Mrs. Everett, who'd insisted on giving her away, squeezed Hazel's arm gently. "Be happy, dear girl," she whispered. "You deserve every bit of it." The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Hazel heard herself make vows to love and honor in sickness and health for better or worse, and heard Cole's voice, steady and sure, promising the same. Reverend Crawford spoke about marriage as a covenant, about two people choosing each other every day, about building a life together on the foundation of faith and love. When he finally pronounced them husband and wife, Cole kissed Hazel with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with tears. The church erupted in applause, and suddenly they were walking back down the aisle together, not as two separate people, but as a married couple. Mr. and Mrs. Cole Maddox. The reception at the hotel was a joyful chaos of well-wishers, food, and dancing. Hazel had never been to a proper celebration before. Aunt Martha had considered such things frivolous, and she found herself overwhelmed by the warmth and generosity of their new community. People brought gifts despite the couple's protests: canned goods, furniture, tools for Cole, books for Hazel. The mayor gave a speech about how Pueblo needed more young couples willing to build their futures in the territory. Sheriff Kowalski toasted Cole as the best deputy he'd ever had. But the moment that touched Hazel most deeply came when Mrs. Patterson stood up, her elderly voice carrying clearly through the crowded room. "I've been teaching for 40 years, she said, and in that time I've seen a lot of young people start their lives together. Some marriages last, others don't. But I can tell you with certainty that this one will endure. Because I've watched these two young people over the past 3 months, and I've seen something rare and precious, two people who make each other better. Hazel makes Cole want to stay in one place and build something permanent. Cole makes Hazel believe she's worthy of being chosen and loved. Together, they're stronger than either could be alone. That's the foundation of a marriage that will last 50 years. The applause was thunderous, and Hazel felt tears streaming down her face. Cole's arm tightened around her waist, and she knew he was equally moved. As the sun began to set, they finally escaped the celebration and walked to their cabin, their home, with well wishes and gentle teasing following them into the October evening. Someone had decorated the porch with wildflowers, and a warm light glowed from inside where friends had obviously prepared things for their arrival. Cole lifted Hazel over the threshold in the traditional way, and she laughed with pure joy as he kicked the door closed behind them. The cabin had been transformed. A fire crackled in the new stove, casting warm light over furniture that hadn't been there before. A proper bed with the quilt Caroline Pritchard had given them. A table set for two, even curtains in the windows that Mrs. Everett must have sewn in secret. "Welcome home, Mrs. Maddox," Cole said softly, setting her down gently. Hazel turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd saved her life and then given her a reason to live it fully. "Welcome home, Mr. Maddox." They stood there in their small cabin, holding each other as the fire crackled and the last light of day faded from the windows. Outside, Pueblo settled into evening, children being called in for supper, shops closing, the normal rhythm of frontier life continuing as it always had. But inside this cabin, two people who'd been lost had found each other and built something new from the wreckage of their pasts. Cole pulled back slightly, his pale blue eyes searching her face. "Are you happy?" Hazel thought about the question seriously. 3 months ago, she'd been abandoned to die on the prairie, certain her life was over at 20 years old. Now she was a married woman with a teaching career, a home, a community that valued her, and a husband who loved her not despite her scars, but because of the strength they represented. "I'm more than happy," she said finally. "I'm whole. For the first time since my parents died, I feel whole." "Good, because I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way." The years that followed proved Cole's promise true. Hazel took over as head teacher when Mrs. Patterson retired, and she became known throughout the territory as an educator who could reach even the most difficult students. Cole advanced from deputy to sheriff when Kowalski stepped down, and he built a reputation as a lawman who was firm but fair, respected by honest citizens and feared by those who weren't. Their cabin expanded room by room as their family grew. First a daughter they named Sarah after Cole's sister, then a son they called Daniel, and finally another daughter they named Eleanor after Mrs. Everett. The cabin that had started as 2 rooms eventually became 5, with a proper garden that produced vegetables all summer and a barn where Cole kept Ash and a milk cow. The town of Pueblo grew alongside them, transforming from a rough frontier settlement into an established community with schools and churches and regular law enforcement. Hazel and Cole were part of that transformation, contributing to the building of something permanent and good in a place that had once been wild. But the story that people told, the one that got retold around campfires and dinner tables for decades, was about how it all started, about the girl left behind by her family, about the cowboy who appeared like something out of a prayer, about 3 days of danger and discovery on the Colorado prairie, about how the worst thing that ever happened to Hazel Thornton turned out to be the beginning of the best thing. Mrs. Everett, who became Grandmother Everett to Hazel and Cole's children, liked to say that God worked in mysterious ways, that sometimes he allowed terrible things to happen because he knew they'd lead to wonderful things. Hazel wasn't sure about the theology of that, but she couldn't deny the outcome. 25 years after that October wedding, Hazel stood in her expanded cabin, now a proper house, and watched her husband play with their grandchildren in the yard. Cole's hair had gone gray at the temples, and he walked with a slight limp from an old injury, but his eyes were still the same pale blue that had first appeared through the prairie heat shimmer all those years ago. Their daughter Sarah, now a teacher herself, was visiting with her husband and 2 children. Daniel was studying law in Denver, but came home every few months. Eleanor, the youngest, was still in school and driving Hazel crazy with the same stubborn independence Hazel herself had possessed at 15. "Mama?" Sarah appeared at her elbow. "You're doing that thing again where you get lost in memories." Hazel smiled. "Sorry, I was just thinking about how I got here, about how strange and wonderful life is." "You mean how you and Papa met? You've told us that story 100 times. And I'll tell it 100 more before I'm done." Hazel watched Cole lift his grandson onto his shoulders, laughing at something the boy said. Because it's important to remember that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes. That being left behind can mean finding your way forward. That the person who saves you might end up being the person you save right back. Sarah hugged her mother's arm. "I'm glad Aunt Martha abandoned you. Is that terrible to say?" "Probably, but I understand what you mean." Hazel turned from the window. "Come on, let's get supper started. Your father will be hungry after playing with those children, and you know how he gets when he's hungry." They worked side by side in the kitchen that had been expanded twice over the years, preparing food for a family dinner that would be loud and chaotic and full of love. And Hazel thought about the girl she'd been, frightened and abandoned on an endless prairie, and wished she could go back and tell her younger self that everything would be all right. Better than all right. That the cowboy who appeared out of nowhere would keep every promise he ever made. That the words, "You'll ride with me now," would turn into a lifetime of riding together through whatever came. But she couldn't go back. And maybe that was all right too. The journey had been hard, but it had led her here, to this kitchen, this family, this life she'd built from nothing but determination and the courage to trust when trust seemed impossible. That night, after the family dinner and the chaos of putting grandchildren to bed and the slow settling of the household, Hazel and Cole sat on their porch watching the stars come out over Pueblo. The town had electric lights now, dimming the stars slightly, but they were still there, the same stars that had watched over 2 strangers on the prairie 25 years ago. "Do you ever regret it?" Cole asked, taking her hand. "Saying yes to me so quickly? We barely knew each other." Hazel squeezed his fingers. "Not once. Not for a single moment in 25 years. She paused. "Do you?" "Never. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Hazel. Still are." Cole lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles the way he had on that boarding house porch so many years ago. "I'd do it all again exactly the same way. The danger, the fear, all of it. Because it led me to you." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who'd learned each other so completely over the decades that words weren't always necessary. Somewhere in town, a child laughed. A dog barked. Life continued its steady rhythm, the same today as yesterday, the same tomorrow as today. But for Hazel and Cole, every day was still a small miracle. Proof that abandonment could lead to belonging, that strangers could become family, that a desperate ride across the prairie could turn into a lifetime of love. The girl who'd been left behind had found everything she'd never known she was searching for. And the cowboy who'd said, "You'll ride with me now," had kept that promise through decades of mornings and evenings, through 3 children and countless students, through the building of a life that was humble but rich beyond measure. They'd been strangers once, brought together by crisis and desperation, but they'd chosen each other every day since, building something that lasted not because it was easy, but because it mattered. And in the end, that was the real story. Not about being saved or abandoned, but about two broken people who'd healed each other and built something whole from the scattered pieces of their pasts. That was the story Pueblo would remember and retell for generations. A love story born on the frontier, forged in danger, and proven in the quiet daily choice to stay, to love, to build. The story of Hazel and Cole Maddox, who'd started with nothing and ended with everything that truly mattered. And it all began with a cowboy appearing through the prairie heat shimmer, looking at an abandoned girl and saying the words that changed everything. "You'll ride with me now."